Duke's Secrets, written by Ayles and published by Starfall Publications. Subscribe to our channel for more audiobooks. Chapter 1. Looking out of her bedroom window across the garden, young Mary Elridge felt at peace. Her life was one of ease and beauty, her heart was at rest, and everything had purpose and meaning. As of yet. Her father, Sir James Elridge of York, was away on important business. Her mother, Lady Diana Elridge, was downstairs entertaining some barons and a countess. These were people she knew from her days as a baron's daughter herself. Marianne was different from her mother. She preferred her shortened name, Mary, and she considered socializing a vexing inconvenience. Mary was hiding away upstairs, waiting for the evening to end so she could have her supper and maybe practice her pianoforte in the assembly room. She was at the cusp of womanhood, no longer young enough to be introduced as a child or excused for her faux pas. Mary was a young woman finally of age to be a wife, yet not quite yet ready for marriage proposals, although her parents would argue this. She had yet to consider herself a respectable, serene young lady prepared for marriage. Since Mary was an only child, her mother was wringing her wrists and pacing the floors quite regularly, fretting about how, when, and where to find the right suitor for her. Mary denied it in the face of others, but she took offence to the assumption that she needed to be managed. She was much of the mind that if her mother did not know what to do with her, she could just let her carry on studying, learning etiquette, and socialising until she did know. Why not remain a child until she was ready to be a woman? Her second cousin, now 23 years old, was still treated as a child. But Mary was not about to say such things to her mother. After all, it was a hard job to be a parent and a lady at once. Despite her insubordinate thoughts, Mary still had deep respect for the woman who had taught her all she knew. So she stayed upstairs and whiled away the hours, a little tired but content. The sun glistened on the rose bushes and the privet, misted with a faint layer of droplets of rain. The hedge cast a shadow over the lawn, hiding the smaller buds in the flower beds. The cold night air smelled delightfully fortifying. It was too dark to continue reading, but not dark enough to light a candle without feeling like she was squandering the house's income. So she sat at the window, watching the sun fall as she listened to the murmur of conversation from the drawing room below. A knock at the door made her jump, but she quickly closed the window and straightened her skirts. "Yes," she replied with caution, unsure of who it was and for what purpose. "It's only me, mistress," the housekeeper's voice echoed. "I am informed that the Baron and Baroness are soon to take their leave, and that your mother wants the dining room laid out so you can have supper with her." Mary's shoulders relaxed at the familiar voice of Miss Ramsbottom. "I will be on my way shortly," she finally said, remembering that a response was most likely required. "And will you please stop calling me mistress? That is more suitable for my mother." "I do not run this household," Mary called out, but she knew Miss Ramsbottom had fled and she was only talking into an empty space. She huffed out an amused stream of air. Sometimes it felt like Mary was indeed the mistress of the house. She was most conscious about the whereabouts of everything. Mary had undoubtedly grown fond of their housekeeper. Miss Ramsbottom showed her and her mother equal levels of respect. Mary smiled to herself in thought. She was already dressed for dinner, and there would be nobody there but her mother and the help. But with guests coming and going, Mary could never be certain. She lit the candle in front of the mirror next to her armoire. After checking her hair and blotting some of the stain from her lips to ensure she would not be chastised for immodesty, she took her candle and headed for the dining room. Although the rooms upstairs were frigid and dark, every candle visible from the front door was lit. This was to impress the guests, surely, and a fire roared in the front room, dining room, assembly room, drawing room. Mary was used to this, though. It was what needed to be done. She much preferred the rigid confines of her chambers and the feeling of possibility that radiated from her walls. This, downstairs, was a facade. Her mother was waiting at the table, but had no plate in front of her. Mary's place was set for 3 courses, and the first already sat on the table under a cover to keep it warm. Mary curtsied to her mother before finding her seat. "I trust all went well, Mother?" she asked cautiously. Her mother looked happy, but that was never a guarantee. Her mother nodded and beamed. "My cousin, the Baroness, complimented me on my dress, and the Countess was so pleased with the poussin she requested the recipe from the kitchen so her cook may prepare the same for her." Mary smiled. "That sounds most wonderful, Mother." Mary couldn't help but notice the hollowness in her mother's eyes, the flicker of hesitation. But, as soon as it came, it fled, and her mother was once again Lady Elridge, the exuberant woman who raised her. Mary looked around, but there were no servants waiting on the table. They were probably cleaning the drawing room after tea. She looked at the plate cover and contemplated lifting it on her own. She would have done so without hesitation a few months ago, but now she needed to act more like a lady. "And the Baron?" Mary asked, looking away from her plate and hoping a servant would arrive before it grew cold. Her stomach began to roar with hunger. Her mother seemed oblivious to the situation, caught in her own mind as she made an effort to find the right words. "The Baron's circumstances were unfortunate. You see, the Count was supposed to be here, as was your father. As neither could make it, the poor Baron was quite beside himself. He expressed his thought that a man in his position ought not to be in the company of women alone. He withdrew to the billiards room and drank some brandy as we women talked in the drawing room." Mary smiled and nodded. "I see. I hope he did not drink too much." Mary nearly snorted in a cynical contest. Her mother cast Mary a disapproving look. "Marianne, such words from a young woman's mouth, such sounds. It is times like these when I truly wonder what I am to do with you. Please think before you speak. And remember, what may appear from a child may be unseemly to a young lady," Mary finished unenthusiastically. Her mother only shook her head in disbelief and gazed off at a painting on the wall. Mary realized she should not have cut her mother off, but there was no changing it now. Mary was trying, perhaps not hard enough, she thought. "Marianne, what am I to do with you? At this rate you will have to marry down." She sighed and shook her head again. "But you married down, and you handle it so wonderfully," Mary replied, trying to act courteous, like a lady. Mary had hoped the words would sound reassuring and supportive, yet all she managed to do was sound prude and degrading. "Marianne, one step down is enough. It is bad enough that I am beneath the Baroness, my own cousin. But imagine if you were to marry a doctor, or a— No, I do not wish to think of it." Her mother sighed. Her face was red and shone with perspiration from worrying. "Where is service? I require my salts. And you must eat. You are becoming gangling again. It does not suit you." Mary contemplated what she should say. At this point she decided it would be best to keep quiet and stay obedient for once. Mary's mother produced a small bell and rang it thrice before a flustered maid appeared in the doorway. "Where were you? My daughter needs her supper." The maid curtsied repeatedly. "I'm so sorry, milady, we were just tidying. I do not wish to hear it. Just serve my daughter and then fetch me my smelling salts." "I seem to have misplaced them," Mary's mother ordered in agitation as the maid lifted the cover from Mary's dish and served her some gravy. Mary was hungry and grateful her meal was now served, but she was not as bothered by the lack of service as her mother was. Her family had recently cut back on staff, as her father took home less in the winter, and they could not afford to keep everyone on starting in September. This only meant that staff had to multitask until at least February, whilst Sir Elridge travelled and socialised more. Mary was never quite sure how being sociable made them money, and she did not question it. Something or other to do with trade and lands. But as usual, this was not a woman's place. All she knew was that their servants were overworked. Her mother, used to the fine life as a daughter to a baron, was less understanding. Despite having lived in this situation for 25 years, she had never grown accustomed to the fluctuations in wealth and standard of living which they experienced. and frequently voiced her disappointment that Sir Elridge had not increased his wealth or status during this time. She had wanted much more from life, and harboured a deep regret that she had chosen to marry a man beneath her station, and Mary knew this. Lady Elridge made it clear the same fate would not befall her daughter. But the thought just made Mary cringe. "I do not see why we are so concerned with marriage as of yet," Mary said as she reached for her wine. "It is not as though I have a single suitor. Indeed, I believe it is 3 months since I last saw a man who was not of the help, or my own father." Her mother glanced towards her with yet another disapproving glare, letting the girl know full well that she was speaking too much again. "When your father and I have found a list of appropriate suitors whom we both agree upon, you may begin to see them. And when that occurs, I expect nothing less of you than a perfectly ladylike composure." Mary nodded and sipped her wine some more. "And do not drink too much wine, dear. It reddens the face and spoils the appetite. Eat your poussin," her mother demanded. The maid returned at this point with the smelling salts. Mary's mother sat at the table and lightly inhaled the pungent air, rubbing her temples lightly with her fingertips. Mary did not mean to cause her mother so much pain, but she was not quite sure how to prevent this either. It was not as though she knew the right answer to everything. How was she supposed to know the right way to be, please her family and keep her identity? After supper, there was no time for the pianoforte as she had originally hoped. Mary made her way upstairs, undressed, washed her face at the basin, and reluctantly climbed into bed. At first, she was concerned she would be so guilty for talking back to her mother that it would interfere with her sleep. But after a few minutes lying awake in the dark, she drifted off. Mary awoke by a loud knocking at her bedroom door. The sun barely glinted beneath the curtains, and from the faint outline she could see her clock was marking 6, long before she usually had to get up for breakfast. But the knocking, although stern, was not fast, or in any way urgent. What could it possibly be? She rubbed her head and face, took a sip of water from the glass beside her bed to make sure her voice was soft and ladylike, and answered. "Yes. Who is it?" "Sorry to trouble you at this hour, but your mother has received a letter and wishes to see you right away." It was Miss Ramsbottom. "Ought I get dressed?" Mary asked, reaching for her bedcoat. "I expect so. It sounded urgent, but I doubt she wants you wandering the house in your bedclothes when the young man could arrive at any moment," the housekeeper replied. Mary felt her heart skip a beat and her stomach tighten. "Young man," she replied cautiously. After all, he could be a servant or a relative, anyone from outside the house, really. "That is all I know," the housekeeper's voice resumed, sounding slightly frustrated, as though she had things to do, which she probably did at that hour of the morning, with a guest on the way and a dozen hands short of help. "All I know is that he shall take breakfast with yourself and your parents, and that I am to prepare the good silverware." "Indeed," Mary replied. "That will be all, Miss Ramsbottom." She bowed her head in submission. "I will send a maid to help you get into your dress." And with that, the footsteps began, then faded down the hallway. Mary washed her face and began combing her hair. During the summer months, a maid would help her with this too, as her hair hung down to her waist and was heavy, requiring brushing with 2 different textures of brush. Her hair required folding, twisting, and countless clasps to make it shine and lift it up into a style considered appropriate and fashionable. It was a hassle, and all her friends wore their hair shorter and turned to wigs for more elaborate dress. However, her mother treasured Mary's hair, and her father, although he insisted that she keep it tied back at all times, had expressed he wanted her to keep her luxurious locks for the benefit of her future husband. Hearing that someone was there had awoken a yearning in her which she did not know existed. The maid arrived just as Mary was ready to tie her hair back. After half an hour of efforts, Mary was finally groomed, dressed, and ready to meet their guest. Walking downstairs, she met a wall of warmth which meant every fire was on again. This guest was someone important, either another baron or perhaps a count. Turning the corner into the drawing room, she saw that it was empty. The table was laid and the food was prepared. The clock was just striking 8. Had it taken her 2 hours to get up? But it was not yet time to dine. Then again, perhaps they would hold it early for their guest. Mary resisted the urge to rush as she walked about the house, looking for her parents, the guest, the servants, or quite frankly, anyone. She quickly noticed that the door to the morning room was shut and heard a faint murmur behind it. Opening the door, she had expected to see some servants cleaning, her parents and the guest, or some small group of people. Instead, her eyes locked with the deep green eyes of a tall man. He was half-dressed, not formal, but definitely knowing he would be in mixed company, and had not yet removed his coat, which was perfectly fitted to his broad back and gleamed like it had recently been brushed. His gloves and hat had been removed, and his hair was impeccably waxed. He was holding a book which he had taken from the shelf and was reading aloud to himself. Mary took a step forward and the man turned around to face her. His surprised expression turned to bemusement, and he flashed a roguish grin. "Why, good morning, Miss Elridge." Chapter 2. Mary's face was cast in crimson red. Here she was, standing in the doorway to her morning room, with a strange man there, reading her father's books, and no one else around. She had no idea what to do in circumstances such as these, so she chose to retreat. "Good morning, sir," she said in a rushed whisper, curtsying before turning around and marching down the hall as fast as she could manage towards the drawing room. She could have sworn she heard a slight laugh as she left. Mary was still flustered at breakfast, sitting down the table from her parents and the new guest. He had been introduced to her by her mother as Mr. Christopher Haskett, in a way that suggested he was not a Mr. at all, but rather that he was concealing his title, and that poor Lady Elridge could barely hold herself back from declaring it. Mary knew that gleam in her mother's eyes. On the one hand, Mary was glad to see her parents looking so happy. Both of them must know who he is and approve, otherwise none of this would be occurring. If only she could work out who and what he was. "I'm so glad you could make it, Mr. Haskett," Mary's mother said, pausing before the name as though to make it even more obvious this was not his true identity. Mary smiled and nodded. "Yes, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." Mr. Haskett grinned back. "It is my hope that we may be more than acquaintances." "But acquaintances shall do for now," Mary added hastily. "Is that not true, Mother?" Mary's mother looked at her with a sternly warning expression. Mary turned to her father, who was smiling, oblivious to the tension between mother and daughter. He served himself another egg, and Mary repressed a sigh. "Actually, Mary," her mother corrected her, "Mr. Haskett is a suitor." There was a pause, and her mother leaned in to whisper, "Your only suitor." Mary glanced over at her mother, but she was clearly both serious and happy about this arrangement. Mary herself, however, found herself at a loss for words. She just looked back over to Mr. Haskett. Of course he was incredibly handsome, and he seemed fairly wealthy too. No doubt he would keep her well. But this seemed more than a little rushed. Her first and only suitor. Surely there was more time. Mary smiled meekly at Mr. Haskett. "Is that so? Then I would love to learn more about you, sir." She helped herself to some toast and marmalade from the tray in front of her. At least during breakfast she knew that she could serve her own food, which was a relief because other than the footman, the servants were absent again. Over breakfast, Mary learned much about Mr. Haskett the businessman, Mr. Haskett the son, Mr. Haskett the brother, Mr. Haskett the student, but nothing of Mr. Haskett the man. His personality, personal interests and history were an enigma shrouded by facts and figures more fitting for a history book. Mary wasn't too fond of history lessons either. Mary wasn't impressed with the man in front of her. He may have made a good first impression, perfect posture, the right countenance, but his lack of desire to be more open was not a quality Mary found attractive in a man. However, she was very well aware that she didn't have any other suitors to compare Mr. Haskett to. After breakfast, her father and mother invited Mr. Haskett to play croquet whilst the weather held, but she excused herself with a headache and locked herself in her room to think. Mary could not fathom why he would be so secretive about his identity, nor why her parents would be comfortable with this. So comfortable, in fact, that they were content to marry their only daughter to him. It was just ridiculous. She pinched herself hard, but to her dismay, she was not dreaming. Mary chose to remain upstairs for the entire morning, requesting only tea and lavender water from the servants. Every time someone knocked at her door, she insisted she had a headache and could not go and join in with the fun. However, by lunchtime she still had no plausible answers and was feeling too hungry to stay upstairs, so she ventured into the dining room. The best-case scenario was that he had gone home already, and she could talk to her parents in private. The worst-case scenario was that she would have to get to know a bit more about her one and only suitor. Luckily for her, he had gone home after an early lunch. The servants were preparing the table, her father was still busy in his office, catching up on the morning's work, and her mother was in the dining room, half supervising the servants, half whiling away the minutes looking at paintings. Mary was relived, but also felt a slight hint of an emotion she was very unfamiliar with, as though she had finished reading a very good book. But this was different, deeper. She dismissed it and walked over to where her mother was looking at one of the paintings by the window. "Mother, may we talk?" Mary asked with a curtsy, not standing up until she had made sure her mother had turned around and observed her deference. "Of course, I trust your headache has improved," her mother replied. "Oh, yes, much better, thank you very much." Mary smiled and hoped that her mother was not wise to her trick. "I just wanted to ask, who is Mr. Haskett?" She hoped her mother would hear the desperation in her voice. Her mother looked to the painting again. "I suppose he will have to tell you that himself. All you need to hear from me is that he is the only suitor your father and I will consider for you, and he is also your new pianoforte teacher." "My new teacher?" Mary gasped. "But he's a suitor, and so young." "So long as your hands are busy playing their keys and the door is open, I believe it is an excellent way for a young lady to get to know her suitor," her mother added in a knowing tone. Mary blushed hotly. "Of course you are right, Mother. Now, no more suggestions of such indecencies, or I may be forced to reconsider the whole affair until you are mature enough to think about it sensibly." Mary's mother smiled and held her daughter's hand. "Trust in me when I tell you that. Mr. Haskett is a very good suitor for you, and you would do well to get to know him and let him learn what a wonderful wife you could make for him." "And how am I to do that when I cannot be told who he is?" Mary replied with exasperation. "Mary, you must trust your parents. Let him tutor you for some time, talk to him and get close to him. You will not regret it." At that moment her father entered the room and Mary made her way to the table. She still felt unprepared for this arrangement, but at least now she felt somewhat braver and reassured. Her parents had to know on some level who this man was. Otherwise they would not be so confident that he was the perfect suitor for her. So she had to put her trust in them and give him a fair chance. But why was it so hard to trust? The day of their first lesson, Mary's stomach was full of butterflies held down by the knot in her throat. It was not so much the prospect of this particular man, whom she hardly knew, but the prospect of spending time with any young man, specifically anyone who could potentially be her future husband. There was something slightly insinuating about it, something which hinted at the romances in her favourite novels, and which made her yearn for her very own tale of romantic bliss. When he arrived, he seemed a little lost, and yet somehow completely and utterly confident in what he was doing. Mary had hoped to learn more about him, but every time she asked him a question, he would either ask her the same question in return or comment on the music. "You are indeed one of the fairest young ladies I have courted," Mr. Haskett said as Mary adjusted a hair clip. Mary smiled and resumed playing her song. "I assume you must be courting many." "A few," replied Mr. Haskett. "A man has to keep his options open. You would not enter a florist and purchase the very first bouquet you see upon opening the door, would you?" Mary shook her head. "I suppose when one has the option of choosing a bouquet, one must choose wisely." "Ah, but every bouquet is sure to find a good home, unless it is sold below its worth. Meanwhile, not every bouquet purchased will smell sweet, nor look fresh, for long after it is brought home. Whomever can afford the bouquet is surely worthy of owning it, but not every bouquet is worth its price," Mr. Haskett explained. Mary could not fault his logic. And yet, why did she feel a pull at her chest when he said that he had other candidates to become his wife? She barely knew this man, and yet she was inexplicably drawn to him. "Tell me, Mr. Haskett, why you are looking for a wife. How come you have decided that it is time?" Mary asked, eager to learn something about the man which was not a number. "Here, let me show you another song." Mr. Haskett evaded the question, motioning for her to rise. He bowed slightly as she stood. Then, once she was seated on a stool nearby, he began playing. Mary contemplated whether it would be rude to ask the question again, but decided against it just in case. But how on earth was she supposed to get to know the man, and he to know her, when he wouldn't let her learn anything about him? It was undeniable that he was a gifted pianist himself. As he demonstrated the scores to her, his fingers glided up and down the keys, nimble as young hares, never missing a single note. The music flowed up from the pianoforte as though summoned by magic. But however talented he was at playing, his teaching method seemed to be half composed of displaying his skills and half expecting her to copy him. "Well, there is one thing I am now absolutely certain of," Mary said, turning a page. "And what is that?" Mr. Haskett inquired. "You are most surely not a teacher," Mary replied. Mr. Haskett laughed slightly too loudly for polite society, then covered his mouth with his hand. "I beg of you to forgive me, Miss Elridge." Despite his apology, his eyes still glinted in a way which suggested that he was either not familiar with the way one ought to carry oneself in proper society, or that he did not much care for it. "But it is true," Mary continued. "You have been here all morning, and not only have you not told me a single thing about your life, but I have learned no new skills whatsoever. Perhaps I ought to fire you." "I do have a bit of advice to help you with," Mr. Haskett replied. Mary was feeling bold, especially in the absence of her parents, and this was heightened by the frustration which Mr. Haskett's presence was causing her. "Pray tell, Mr. Haskett." "I would advise that when a man is teaching you pianoforte, you keep on playing so that your parents do not get ideas about what is happening and banish him forever." Mary felt her face and chest grow very hot all of a sudden. It was not so much what he said, although what he said was indeed improper, but the very tone of his voice as he said it which made her uncomfortable. "Mr. Haskett," she whispered harshly, her eyes aflame as they locked with his. "I am terribly sorry," he replied. "I did not intend to. I am not familiar with the sort of society where that is acceptable, nor do I intend to be," Mary said, standing up. "I am sorry, but I must leave now." She turned around and left the room, headed for her bedroom. She was still none the wiser as to who exactly this man was, but she was not about to tolerate such remarks from him either. Somehow she knew that she was expected to charm and enamour him. But how can one charm and enamour a person they do not know the slightest bit about? She had barely closed her door when it slid open and her mother walked in, looking incredibly stressed, clutching her smelling salts. "Mary, I hear you have walked out of your piano lesson with Mr. Haskett." "I have, Mother. He said something quite improper." "I am sure you understand," Mary replied. "What was it that he said to you, Marianne?" Lady Elridge sat down on the edge of Mary's bed. Mary shook her head. "I will not repeat it. However, he implied something most improper, and I will not reward him with my company, if that is what I am to expect." Mary's mother sighed deeply. "Mary, I understand why you left the room, and I am proud of you for protecting yourself. However, unless what Mr. Haskett said was so absolutely profane, you cannot marry him. I must ask you to give him another opportunity. Did he say such a thing?" Mary shook her head. "No, he did not. It was merely improper, a little insinuating and thoughtless, not profane." "Then you must give him another opportunity, if not for your own sake, at least to satisfy me that you made an effort," her mother replied. Mary furrowed her brow and sat down beside her mother. "But why? I know nothing of this man. If I at least knew who he was, something about him to explain what I ought to expect. At this moment I do not know what will happen subsequent to any interaction or conversation. I cannot live with this." Her mother held her hand. "Mary, I cannot tell you who he is. I wish I could, I truly do. But the only condition under which he would court you is that you must know nothing about him." "Martha, I cannot decide whether to marry a man based on nothing," Mary replied. "You will not decide, Mary. He will," her mother corrected her. "Your father and I know that he is a perfect candidate. However, he is not certain of you, and you must prove yourself to him." "Then inspire me, mother," Mary contested. It was painful to be answering back at her own mother so much, but the situation felt so dire. "Please tell me something, anything that will redeem his character in my eyes." Lady Elridge looked about the room, then stood, peered out of the door and down the hall, and satisfied they were truly alone, closed the door. "Very well, Mary, I will let you know one thing." Chapter 3. Mary held her breath, but the result was underwhelming. "Mr. is not Haskett's true title," her mother explained. "He occupies a most prestigious position in society, and it is a true blessing to us that he will consider you for his bride. Due to his more sheltered upbringing at times, he may act improperly and thoughtlessly. But this is because it is not often that anyone has corrected his ways. If you can see past this, I assure you that no better future awaits you than the one you could enjoy with Mr. Haskett." Mary sighed. "I wish you could tell me more." Lady Elridge rested a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. "When it is right for you to know, you shall know." Despite a good night's sleep, Mary awoke more confused than ever. Mary knew from what her mother had told her that Mr. Haskett was most certainly a wonderful man and an ideal husband. She did not for one moment distrust her mother's wisdom or judgment. What she did doubt, however, was her own ability to act according to the circumstances, because she was still not truly aware of what the circumstances were. She knew she would have to see Mr. Haskett again for a lesson that afternoon, but she did not know what to do, especially not now that she felt pressure to impress him. "I cannot do this, Mother," Mary said as soon as she found her mother alone. "Whatever do you mean, Marianne?" her mother replied. Mary sighed. "I cannot let a man I do not know court me. I know nothing of courting as it stands, and to try and fathom the mysteries of courtship with a man who is an enigma. I cannot." Her mother shook her head sternly. "You must." "How? Whatever can I do?" Mary asked. Her patience was wearing thin. Mary's mother shook her head again, this time more slowly, and sniffed her phial of smelling salts. "Mary, I feel you have been a bit disorderly of late." Mary did not deny it. She nodded. "I am confused. I am tired. I do apologize, Mother." "And there it is again," her mother replied. "I am not sure that you are ready for courtship if you cannot master simple manners." "These are difficult times for me, Mother. I assure you I can manage myself through them." "That is not what you have displayed thus far," her mother corrected her. "And it is precisely during hard times when a lady ought to shine as a beacon of civilization, not revert to the ways of girls and boys." Mary furrowed her brow. "But I do feel like a girl," she said after a brief pause. Tears welled in her eyes. She did not want to cry, but it was all far too much. All she wanted, all she needed at this moment was a little understanding from her mother. In return, Mary was getting chastised. Lady Elridge softened a little upon seeing how frustrated her daughter was. She walked up and handed the girl a handkerchief for her tears. "Here. I know that this is not easy for you. This is not easy transition for any young woman. But it is something we must all do, and do with a brave countenance." Mary wiped the tears from her eyes and looked back to her mother. "But like this?" "Every courtship has its challenges, Mary. It is up to the woman to meet those challenges with dignity and strength." Mary nodded, but did not feel as reassured as she would have liked. "If you wish, I can excuse you for a few days, not long, but a few days deeper in the countryside, at a rural retreat. There you may have some time to recover from your emotions and approach your courtship with renewed vigour," her mother suggested. "I would very much like that, Mother," Mary replied. "Then it is decided. 3 days and 2 nights only, in a rural retreat in Oxfordshire, so that the country air may strengthen and revitalise you. And then you are to return immediately and court Mr. Haskett in earnest," Lady Elridge insisted. "You shall be escorted by your cousins, Thomas and Antoinette. He shall ensure the 2 of you behave properly and are safe, and she shall ensure that you get the full rest you require and plenty of country air." Mary was thrilled by this. Antoinette was about her own age and had been her dearest friend since early childhood. She was also intelligent, informed, and amiable. She was the perfect companion for this 3-day retreat, not least of all because of all people Antoinette would be able to tell Mary what she was to do. That very evening Antoinette's landau pulled up outside the house. Mary's bags were secured, and they were on their way to the countryside. The 2 girls were on their own inside the landau, with Thomas Gibbs riding on an elevated seat behind the driver. Even so, it took until the house was out of view for Mary and Antoinette to relax enough to begin to discuss the mystery of Mr. Christopher Haskett. "If you ask me, it sounds perfectly thrilling," Antoinette said with a slight sigh. "Like something out of a story." "But it is not so in real life, Annie." Mary shook her head. "It is so much more complicated and confusing. I wish I knew what to do, like the ladies in our books always know." Antoinette nodded. "I understand. I too wish things were clearer to me." "How is your search for a suitor? Any luck?" Mary asked. "Too much luck," Antoinette replied. "My parents wish for me to choose between a number of appropriate suitors. I am not prepared. I cannot make such a monumental decision on my own. They have reassured me that every man they are considering is a good choice, and that they would be happy for me to marry any of them. And yet, that simply makes it all so much more confusing." Mary sighed. "I am not certain of what to do at all. I do not know how Mr. Haskett compares to other men, and I do not have enough experience talking with men to work out his ways and persuade him to converse openly with me. Unfortunately, dear cousin, these are the circumstances we find ourselves in. These are the paths chosen for us," Antoinette replied. "Do you recall how, when we were younger, I was often envious of your silky dark mane, and you of my golden curls? This is the same sort of situation, and now as then, it is hopeless to wish for what we will never possess. We must consider our real circumstances and what must be done to ensure that our marriages are successful. In my case, I must choose a man. And in my case, I must become familiar with my suitor and make it known that I can be an excellent wife to him," Mary replied. She paused briefly to make sure she really wanted to add this, but in her heart of hearts she knew it was the right thing to do. "I suppose we ought to cancel this retreat and head home." Antoinette nodded. "That certainly sounds wise. If you are to become familiar with Mr. Haskett, the first step would be to spend time in his company." Mary was overcome with gratitude and joy for her cousin. "Oh, Antoinette, please come back and stay with us. I have no confidence talking to this man on my own, but perhaps with you by my side I can summon the courage. And besides, you are so much wiser than I am as to a proper courtship. With your protection, support and wisdom, I am certain that I shall be able to discover Mr. Haskett's true nature and prove to him that I am worthy to be his wife." Antoinette hugged her cousin and best friend closely and petted her hair. "Why, of course I shall. You are my favourite out of all our cousins, and I want nothing more than to see you well married. And from what your mother has said, if you manage to persuade Mr. Haskett, you shall be married very well indeed." Mary nodded and glanced out the window. "I do hope so. It would be a shame if after so much effort he turns out to be just a terrible tutor." Antoinette giggled before waving her hand out of the landau. Nothing happened, so she waved again, this time more forcefully. Her brother's voice came from the front. "Yes. Do the ladies require anything?" "We shall be returning to our cousin Marianne's house and staying there a few days," Antoinette replied. There was silence from the other side, but Mary could have sworn she heard an exasperated sigh before Thomas spoke up again. "Very well. Turn around, Davies. We shall be returning to Thistle Manor." Mary felt a little guilty for having wasted Thomas's time, and yet she knew that her own time, and Antoinette's, had not been wasted at all. They had gained something from their brief outing. They now had a plan which could lead Mary to successfully court Mr. Haskett. Mr. Haskett did not seem particularly impressed when it was announced that Antoinette would be joining them for their lessons. However, he also did not challenge the situation. Mary wondered if he had responded in a similar manner when she left him by the pianoforte just 2 days prior. She had, after all, demonstrated that she would not tolerate impropriety from him, so it was only natural that he would be on his best behaviour and highly complacent. Still, by that gleam in his eye, it was clear to Mary that he would have preferred to continue the lessons privately. "Have you played long?" he asked Mary, selecting several books from the shelf. "Do you believe you could play me some Purcell?" "I shall attempt to, although I am not familiar with his work," Mary admitted. "My previous teachers preferred to ensure that I could play beautiful music successfully rather than focus on any particular composer." "Indeed, but surely you ought to be quite familiar with the names. Lully, Rossi, Sands," Mr. Haskett replied, placing the books down on the bench in turn. "I am afraid not," Mary replied. "I am but familiar with the scores." "My mother says that to put the name before the music is to turn art into a popularity contest," Antoinette remarked. "On the contrary, our music is a great piece of our history, and we must record and revere those who master it," Mr. Haskett replied. Antoinette raised an eyebrow which suggested she was not pleased by his reply, but also unsure as to whether her station would allow her to correct him. If he were a lord, she would easily be stationed above him. Some barons too. But then again, perhaps he was above her. She furrowed her brow and made eye contact with Mary, who lightly shrugged and resumed playing. "You are a true virtuoso," Mr. Haskett commented. Mary beamed. "Well, I have been playing since I was a little girl. Pray tell, when and where did you learn pianoforte?" Mr. Haskett smiled. "I learned from my mother." "Oh." Mary couldn't think of anything else to say. There was a brief pause. "Well, that still tells me absolutely nothing about you." "Does it not?" Mr. Haskett replied with a flash of his roguish grin. "You could be anyone, really. Except a pianoforte teacher. We have ruled that one out," Mary said, and Antoinette giggled. Mr. Haskett cast a brief glare in Antoinette's direction, then gave a slow, deliberate bow to Mary. "If you think so little of my teaching skills, then perhaps we ought to take a walk in the garden instead. The weather is quite lovely for the time of year. I believe a light shawl is all you'll require." Mary smiled and nodded towards him. "I think that is a splendid idea." The girls found their shawls and bonnets as Mr. Haskett put on a light coat, and then all were ready for their walk. Mr. Haskett, however, had a different idea. "Antoinette, my good young lady, there is no need for you to accompany us here. We shall simply walk around the garden. Why, if you stand at the gate, you shall be able to see us the entire time," Mr. Haskett explained. Antoinette gave him a knowing look, and then nodded to Mary. Mary trusted her cousin. Antoinette understood all the norms of courtship, so if she believed it was the proper thing to do, Mary would follow her guidance. Mr. Haskett presented his arm, and Mary felt a slight pull in her stomach. She had held the arms of boys and men before, of course. But this was different. This was not an acquaintance or a relative, and she was not a little girl. This was a man who wished to marry her, and this was the first time she would be touching him. She felt her hand shake slightly as she raised it and rested it into the fold of his elbow. He lifted his left hand and briefly rested it on her fingertips. The shaking subsided. Looking up at him, she knew she was blushing. "Let us walk," he said. Mary nodded. Yes. They began walking down the garden, all the while under Antoinette's watchful eye. "You have a beautiful garden, very well kept," Mr. Haskett said, looking around. Mary nodded. "Thank you." She glanced around, making sure they were properly out of Antoinette's earshot. "Why did you choose to court me?" "Because you are a good choice," he replied. "And what makes me a good choice?" Mary pressed. "You are of marrying age, which is always a positive, and you are single, which is in your favour too." "Is that all? Our housekeeper is of age and unwed, yet you are not walking with her," Mary replied. "Then you are answering your own question." Mr. Haskett laughed. "You are of age, unwed, and of some status." "If that is all it takes to get a man's attention, I suppose," Mary continued, feeling bolder. "Although following your metaphor of the bouquets, I was rather expecting you were not rushing into the florist to seize the very first one you laid eyes upon." "On the contrary, that is why we are here," Mr. Haskett replied, "that I may observe each bouquet, see in it its potential, and make a wise judgment." "Perhaps then," Mary began tentatively, "we ought to reach an agreement." Mr. Haskett stopped walking and Mary's hand slid from his arm. She turned to face him. A perplexed, yet somewhat bemused expression rested on his lips. "An agreement?" "For everything you learn of me, you must tell me something about yourself," Mary added. "It is only fair, if I some day am to become your wife, that we enter our matrimony knowing equal amounts about each other." "Very well. I am also unattached, of marrying age, and I clearly have enough status for your parents to consider me an appropriate suitor," he said. "That is not enough. You know where I live, my hobbies, and who my parents are," Mary pressed. "3 more facts? Very well. You already are aware that I play pianoforte, and that my mother taught me." "That is but one," Mary smiled in amusement. "You are one of the loveliest young women I have ever courted, and I would very much like to continue courting you. If all goes well, perhaps some day soon we shall marry," he explained. "Would you like that?" Mary stilled. Slowly, heat rose from her core and pink flushed her cheeks. "You owe me 2 more, Mr. Haskett." She chose to deflect. Mr. Haskett smiled a wicked grin and produced an exaggerated sigh. "Very well, very well. I have no living family." He paused, and there was a glint of desire in his eyes. "And I like cats. Will that do?" Mary laughed quietly. "I suppose it will have to. Although you can tell very much about a man from his taste in pets," she contorted. "Such as?" "I am not sure. I shall have to ask Antoinette." Mary giggled again. Mr. Haskett was not so bad after all. "What can she tell you that I cannot?" Mr. Haskett asked, moving in closer so that their shoulders lightly touched. He managed to brush her fingertips with his thumb. Or was that just the wind? "Her real name," Mary said. Chapter 4. The next morning Mary was disappointed to find that Antoinette was not at breakfast. In fact, she was still not home. She and her brother headed into town, apparently on important and confidential business. But Antoinette's sudden absence only made Mary curious. She knew that Antoinette would share absolutely everything with her. And so, the fact there was seemingly a secret between them left Mary feeling eager. If her conscience was right, she knew it would be a temporary secret, one to be held until all the pieces were in place. Where was Antoinette? Who was she with? Although the questions were burning up inside her, Mary knew that with a little patience she would soon know what confidential business her cousin was attending to in town. Mary spent her morning alone, reading as she often did. Being an only child, she had grown accustomed to spending time on her own. At first it was because she was too young to be trusted running around the house when guests were present. Then because she had to attend to her studies, not spend her time at parties and social dinners. And now because a young woman ought not overexert herself or flaunt herself about the house when guests were present. At times she wondered whether or not she might have socialized more had she been raised in a nunnery. And yet, despite her curiosity about the wider world, she had never truly ventured out into it. She would tell herself it was parental restrictions, or just the way a proper young lady ought to behave. But deep down she knew that it was because she was scared, too scared to go out alone. And the prospect of having a husband who could provide her with company and protection as she explored the world, it thrilled her. The lesson came and Antoinette was still not home. Mr. Haskett therefore insisted to play with the door open as before. It was one of the little luxuries of courtship, that if a couple wanted time away from prying eyes and ears that they may learn more of each other, so long as the music were playing it would be acceptable for them to meet over a pianoforte or a violin. Mary was glad of this, and of every other opportunity she had to decipher the mystery that was Mr. Haskett. "I used to play polo," Mr. Haskett said suddenly, "and hunt. But after I fell from my horse and broke my ankle, I never had the courage to attempt horse riding again." "Oh," Mary said, not quite sure what to make of that information, let alone how to respond. "Now, seeing as I have told you something about myself, I suppose you shall have to tell me something about yourself," he asked hopefully. Mary smiled. Now perhaps there could be progress, and she could get to know the man her parents wished for her to wed. "Very well, Mr. Haskett. I have never cared for needlework. I found Sunday school to be horribly dull." Mary repressed a slight laugh. Mr. Haskett reminded her of the boys who used to skip Sunday school to go fishing in the pond, now that she thought about it. "I loved Sunday school, and was always thrilled to see my friends." "I find that fact banal. I would like another one," Mr. Haskett replied, smirking. Mary would normally feel insulted by such a smile, and yet she could tell it was genuine, and somehow that made her feel happy. He was enjoying their conversation, enjoying talking to her. She too was beginning to enjoy his company. "Do you? Well, I have never been courted by any man before you," she admitted. "I was already aware of that," he replied, the smirk never leaving his face. "It ought to be something I do not know." "Do you intend to dismiss every fact I reveal to you? Or are you merely stalling to avoid telling me anything more about yourself?" Mary asked. "I found that rude. That is a fact about me," Mr. Haskett replied. Mary laughed, then remembered how she was told to behave and covered her mouth with her hand to hide the giggles. "Pardon me, sir, I forgot myself, but you are being most distracting." "Pardon me, mademoiselle, but I find you very attractive," Mr. Haskett said, "if you do not mind me saying so." Mary felt her face flush hot, and her hands halted over the keys. She could hardly believe he had said that. It felt so sudden, so intrusive amidst the playfulness. And yet it pleased her greatly. "Even if I did mind," she said eventually, "you have already said it." "But do you mind?" Mr. Haskett turned the page for her, leaning close over her shoulder, the rich, yet not overpowering scent of his cologne surrounding her like a fine mist. Mary felt her face grow hotter and hotter. "Not in the slightest, Mr. Haskett." Mr. Haskett smiled, then glanced at the clock. "It appears the time for our lesson has ended. I have some affairs to attend to." Mary nodded, finding it hard to move or breathe, let alone speak. "I shall see you again tomorrow, yes?" "Why, of course." His footsteps echoed out the door and down the hallway. "Goodbye, Miss Elridge." But it was not until his footsteps had disappeared, the front door had been loudly closed, and his town coach had clattered past the window that she finally found herself able to move. She collected the music books and returned them to the shelf. "He finds me attractive," she whispered to herself as she replaced the last score. She felt her pulse racing, and yet she was strangely relaxed. She smiled and ran her fingers down the spine of the book thoughtfully. It seemed that this courtship was going just as her mother wanted it to. Leaving the room, Mary was overjoyed to hear her cousins' voices emerging from the drawing room. She quickly remembered the secretive manner in which they had left that morning, parting before breakfast and not telling anyone what they were to do. She knew that whatever Antoinette had to tell her, it would be exciting. The drawing-room door was open, so she walked in and curtsied. Antoinette smiled at Mary, but it appeared forced. "My pianoforte lessons have ended," Mary remarked. Antoinette nodded. "Did you enjoy yourself?" "Very much so. Where did you go so early this morning?" Mary asked. "I simply must tell you all about our day in town," Antoinette said, offering a conspiratorial smile. Mary smiled back. "Shall we adjourn to the front room?" Antoinette nodded and stood up. "Yes, I believe my brother has a book he wishes to find in the study, but we can go on our own. I require some feminine company after this morning." Thomas did not need any more hints. He stood and declared, "Indeed, I need to find a book to read later," and left the room. Mary followed Antoinette into the front room, where Antoinette looked around before closing and locking the door. "Why the secrecy?" Mary asked with a slight laugh. "My mother was the same—" "Hush now. There is something very important I have discovered about Mr. Haskett," Antoinette interrupted, tapping Mary's mouth with her index and middle finger to demand silence. "He is not the man you believe him to be." Mary blinked, but stayed quiet and merely nodded. "I think you may need to be seated. This information is," Antoinette drew a deep breath, "one of the most thrilling things I have ever heard." Mary followed her cousin's advice and sat down on a nearby chair. "Very well, I am seated. The so-called Mr. Haskett is in fact His Grace the Duke of York." Antoinette leaned in closely and was clearly tense with excitement. "Your teacher and suitor is secretly a duke. Please forgive me. This is the most exciting thing which has ever happened to anyone I have ever known. I have no idea how I shall ever keep this a secret. A duke, Mary." Mary stared at her cousin wide-eyed. Surely there must be some mistake. Why would a duke have any interest in the daughter of a minor noble? And why would he be so secretive? "I do not understand it myself, but it is very clear that it is he, the recent heir to the Duchy of York." Antoinette practically swooned. "If you do not wish to have him, perhaps I shall persuade my parents to invite him for tea," she remarked. Mary shook her head. "I very much like him, thank you." "More so now than ever, I suppose," Antoinette hinted in a whisper. "I simply cannot believe it," Mary replied. "Why, if I had known he were a duke all along, I am not sure what I would have done, but I am certain that I would have done everything better." "Perhaps you ought to ask him yourself then," Antoinette said, "during tomorrow's lesson. I am sure he has his reasons." Mary nodded. "That I shall." Mary felt her stomach turning as she waited for Mr. Haskett, no, His Grace Duke Christopher Haskett of York, to arrive for their lesson. On the one hand, she was excited and ready to confront the man and persuade him to confess his secret. On the other, she was afraid of being in a position to confront such a high-ranking noble, and was not sure of how he would react. As the Duke walked in through the door and bowed lightly to her, she curtsied deeply. "Good afternoon, Your Grace," Mary said, not looking up from the floor. Now there was no opportunity to pretend she did not know. It felt somewhat wrong to her, to change their relationship so suddenly when it was going so well. But it was also wrong to base a relationship on a lie. He may be happy to court her pretending to be someone else, but she would not play along with his little game. He was silent for so long that she stood up straight, blushing slightly awkwardly. "You know?" he finally asked her. She nodded. I do, Your Grace. He sighed and avoided eye contact. What am I to do now? Who told you? Your mother. Mary shook her head. I discovered it on my own. He sighed again and walked over to the window seats where he sat down. Why would you do such a thing? Your Grace was being so secretive. I could not bear it any longer. I do apologize. Mary felt a sensation wash over her, as though she had done something terribly, horribly wrong. What am I to do now? All that I wanted was to become familiar with you in private, without you knowing my title. Was that too much to ask? And stop calling me Your Grace. I cannot abide it. He rested his forehead into his hand and rubbed his temples. You did not wish for me to know? How come? Mary asked. Why, of course I did not want you to know. A young woman such as yourself, daughter of a struggling lord, and a woman who gave up the title of Baroness. Why, when girls like you find out who I am. Lord Haskett shook his head. How am I to know what you truly think of me? How am I to know whether you are truly the woman you present yourself as, or a wolf in sheep's clothing, reaching for my title, my wealth and my lands? You knew me before I knew who you were, Mary replied. Not well enough. Your attitude has already begun to change, and you have barely just discovered my identity. Where is your wit, your burgeoning defiance? If this is how you are today, what will you be tomorrow? Lord Haskett looked out the window. I suppose you will no longer be courting me, Mary realized with some dismay. I am not sure, Lord Haskett replied. I find you a very attractive young woman, and I wish to cultivate your genuine interest and fascination. But knowing who I am, I cannot be sure if you are interested in my status or my person. To what end would we be courting? To allow you to put on an act, to present yourself in the best possible light with the hopes of marrying a duke and saving your family's reputation and lands. I can assure you that I am most decidedly not that way inclined, Your Grace, Mary protested. Then why, pray tell, are you so interested in courting me all of a sudden now that you know I am a duke? He contested. I am merely afraid that I could lose your company following this confusion, Mary replied, and lose my status, and my money, and my hand in marriage, Lord Haskett said with an eyebrow raised. Mary clenched her fists. If that is what you will believe, you are at liberty to do so. Forgive me for at any point holding the belief that you may be an attractive, intelligent, talented man. Forgive me for believing that you were truly coming to love me. His eyes met hers. I could love you, Marianne, but I am no longer sure if you will ever love me. Then give me time to show you who I am, Mary replied, to show you that I will be a good wife to you, that we make a fine pair. Lord Haskett shook his head and sighed. Very well, Miss Elridge. I shall give you an opportunity to show me that you are not like the countless women who request my courtship, in writing and through their parents every single day. I shall give you the opportunity to be a good and decent woman, to be genuine, and to be yourself. Mary curtsied. I am glad of it, although I do hope you will cease pretending to be a pianoforte teacher. Lord Haskett forced a weak smile. I fancied myself a rather good teacher. Your Grace, I have not learned a single thing since you have taught me. She smiled. He laughed. Perhaps you are a terrible student. Perhaps I am, Mary conceded. Perhaps you ought to return tomorrow and continue to attempt to teach me Lully anew. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Lord Haskett replied. But for now I must away. I have many things to consider. With a curtsy and a bow, they parted ways.
Before we continue into the story, make us a favor. Hit the subscribe button. This way we will be able to create more audiobooks for free for you. Thank you again. Now, back to our story.
That evening Mary felt lost and confused. He had sworn that he would return the next day and carry on as before. However, she knew deep down that things were about to change. A letter arrived the next morning. My most esteemed hosts, Lord and Lady Elridge, and Miss Mary Elridge, I must apologise, but I shall not be available to see your daughter for some weeks. There has been an unforeseen event, and I am required at home. I advise that you hire a new tutor in the time being. Yours sincerely, Mr. C. Haskett. Chapter 5. Mary sat at the writing desk in the study looking at the letter. She ought not have opened it. It may have been addressed to her, but it was addressed to her parents first. But now that she had opened it, she felt compelled to at least do something. She ought not be in the study either. That was why it was the perfect place to hide. Her father was away on business once again. The servants only ever cleaned this room when requested, and her mother never entered. Lady Elridge constantly expressed that the study was a place for men, not women or children. But Mary wanted to hide. She knew that this letter could tear into the heart of her mother's hopes and dreams for her. Mary was not certain she could remedy this. Why had she confronted Mr. Duke Haskett about his true identity? Now he had fled. Of course, it was possible that Duke Haskett was being honest. It was possible that he genuinely had been called away on urgent business, and that he would return in under 2 months to resume courting her. That is what Mary kept repeating to herself at least. But the timing was just too precise. Mary felt as though she was to blame. And how could she face her mother after such a disaster? But after half an hour of fretting, Mary knew full well what she ought to do. Because for a young woman in her position there was nothing she could do. She sighed and returned the letter to the envelope. She then warmed a letter opener over the candle, before lightly melting the back of the seal and closing the letter once more. There was nothing she could do but pretend she had never opened it, make sure her parents read it, and hope that Duke Haskett was being truly honest and not merely evasive. Peering out into the hallway, she observed that she was alone, then slipped out of the study and quietly shut the door. Now just to find my mother. "Good morning, mistress," a woman said. "Oh, Miss Elridge." It was Miss Ramsbottom. How long had she been there? Mary smiled. "Good morning. Are you looking for your mother? You know she does not frequent the study. She is at her toilette." Mary nodded. "I shall go to her then, thank you." Mary could not help but feel as though something was amiss then, but still she was simply glad that she was not questioned any further. But of course she wasn't. She was a young woman, not a child anymore. Gone were the days of being scolded and blackmailed by senior housekeepers. Now she would be taken more seriously than any member of staff, even than her father's butler. It was at once a relief and a slight shock to reach this realization. Her mother was indeed still busy applying her makeup. Fashion demanded a lighter powder and a softer eye, but her mother was dated in terms of appearance. She insisted on thicker powder and a good smudge of rouge. The door stood slightly ajar, no doubt left that way by busy staff. For a moment, Mary stood in awe of her mother. Here was a woman who represented everything Mary admired. Sure, she was no romantic heroine, but she was a beautiful, proud, capable woman, happily married and managing a reasonable estate. Lady Elridge considered herself to have suffered a great loss in marrying down, but she could not be blamed for her own parents' lack of judgment, and she had handled her life well. Mary hoped that she could maintain the same decorum and strength when she too was married. She knocked at the door lightly. "Oh, Mary, how lovely. Do come in. I require assistance with my hair," her mother said with a smile. "We have received a letter," Mary said, passing it to her mother as she looked for the comb. Her mother, much like herself, kept her hair very long and liked it done up quite high. To Mary, it had always been a treat to comb her mother's luxurious locks ever since she was little. As she drew the brush through her mother's hair, she heard the letter crinkle open and braced herself. Lady Elridge gasped. "No, this cannot be." "What does it say, Mother?" Mary asked as innocently as she could manage. "That he cannot continue to see you, provisionally of course, but—" Mary's mother sounded quite flustered. "But I have heard these same words before. Oh, Mary," she said with a sigh. "Whatever do you mean, Mother?" Mary asked. "I do hope that I am wrong, but I fear for the worst. Mr. Haskett may no longer be interested in wedding you," she replied. Mary felt her chest and stomach tighten a little. It was one thing to assume this herself. But if even her mother, who knew about such matters, could detect some hesitance in Duke Haskett's letter, then it almost certainly was there. "Surely not, Mother," Mary asked. "Men of his status do have much work to attend to. He is probably away on business of an importance we cannot even imagine." I hope so," Lady Elridge replied, taking a small phial of salts from the table and uncorking them. The powerful scent reached even Mary and tickled her throat. But Lady Elridge seemed relaxed after a few breaths. "In any case, I shall write to him and request absolute clarity. Until then, we must take his word as true and continue as if your wedding were certain." Mary nodded, but she could see the distress in her mother's face, and it made her heart heavy. And yet, she could not reveal that she had confronted Duke Haskett about his true identity. What would her mother think? What would she say? She may even deem Mary too young and too foolish to marry altogether. Mary bit her lip and resumed combing her mother's hair. 2 days later, Mary's mother was pacing the front room. Although she had replied to the letter the same afternoon, they had yet to receive a response from Duke Haskett. Mary had been attempting to reassure her that it was just he was away from his country home, or too busy to receive letters. But Lady Elridge's mind was running away with her. I must write him again. Perhaps he did not receive our last letter," she pondered. "If you believe it necessary," Mary replied, watching her mother pacing back and forth. "And yet, if he has received it, then my writing may be an intrusion on some serious affairs, and most unwelcome. I could turn him from you unnecessarily," she mused, pausing before suddenly pacing again. Mary wasn't sure what to say anymore. It was her mother who knew of such things in the first place. Ordinarily, in such situations, the husband would be the first person to ask. But Sir Elridge was, and always had been, a knight, a common minor noble. He did not know the ways of the upper classes, let alone how one goes about joining them. So it all rested on Lady Elridge's shoulders, and she was stuck. "Oh, Mary, what are we to do?" she asked. Mary shook her head. "I do not know. I suppose we can only wait. But if we do choose to wait, and some other young lady's family approached him in that time, then we lose our one good chance at marrying you. Such opportunities rarely arise." Mary nodded. "I do not know what we ought to do, Mother. I trust whatever you decide." Lady Elridge sat down in an armchair and shook her head slowly. "I do not know, Mary. I do not know the right thing." She raised her fingertips to her temples as her other hand uncorked the small phial of salts. Mary sat down on the chair beside her mother, and they held hands as Lady Elridge sighed and inhaled the fumes. Then it happened so suddenly that Mary could not think to do anything. A hand slipped out from under Mary's, the phial clinked on the floor, and Lady Elridge collapsed from the chair, hitting the ground with a thud. Wide-eyed, Mary stood up from her seat. "Help! Someone send help! Call for a doctor!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside her mother. She slipped an arm under her mother's armpit and pulled her up against her own body. Noticing that her mother's skirts had crumpled, she quickly pulled them so that they covered her legs, before reaching over for the phial of salts. It was barely out of reach. "Help! Please!" Mary cried out again. Her fingers wrapped around the phial. Some salts had spilled, but it was still half full and pungent. She wafted it below her mother's nose. A maid appeared in the doorway. "A doctor is on his way, miss," she said, panting slightly. "May I be of assistance?" Mary nodded. "Yes, we must move her to the chaise longue." She nodded towards where it sat, by the window at the far side of the room, "and have her recline there." The maid nodded back and swiftly marched to the chaise longue to clear the pillows and books that had been placed there. Lady Elridge groaned. Mary stroked her mother's hair and face. "Do not worry, but you must rest. A doctor is on the way. Shall we go to the chaise to recline?" Lady Elridge looked around, confused, and slowly shook her head. "Come, mother, you must rest," Mary insisted. Mary and the maid each took one of Lady Elridge's arms and lifted her to her feet. She wobbled, but with support from the two girls she was able to remain upright and slowly but surely made her way to the chaise longue, where they turned her around, helped her to sit down, and lifted her legs up so that she could recline. Mary sat beside her mother, preventing her from falling from the chaise longue, but also to gently waft the smelling salts below Lady Elridge's nose, in the hopes that the fumes would assist in her recovery. It felt like hours before the doctor arrived, and in that time Mary's mother made no further recovery. She simply lay there, staring up at the streams of light descending from the window, gripping her right hand in her left one. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy, and her breathing was fast and shallow. The doctor shook his head as soon as he saw her. "Let us get to the bottom of this, shall we?" he said in a tone of voice which at once suggested he had a vague idea what the problem was, and was also persuaded he could not help with it. After a brief examination, during which he checked Lady Elridge's pulse, eyes, and attempted to persuade her to talk, he took Mary to one side, leaving the maid applying a cold compress to Lady Elridge's forehead. "Ordinarily I would explain this to the husband, but as he is not here and time is of the essence, I must defer to the person who presently holds the most authority in the home, yourself." Mary nodded sternly. Inside she was petrified, but she knew that right now everything depended on her, and she had to carry herself properly and make all the right choices, otherwise her mother's health, and perhaps life, would be at risk. "I understand. Do go on." "Your mother is in a state known as dementia, or at least the early stages. Put simply, she is not reacting to the world outside her. I do believe this was brought on by an intense level of emotion which, as a woman, she could not handle. She appears to be under some form of great duress at the present moment. Now, if this were left unattended, she may be, and please do not be alarmed, miss, but she may be sent to the asylum." Mary let out a gasp, feeling sick to her stomach. "Please do not be alarmed. Breathe, miss," the doctor insisted. Mary nodded slowly and drew a couple of deep breaths. "Please continue," she said. "Now, if this were to continue, an asylum might be necessary. However, I see no reason why this ought to continue. She has no family history of madness. In fact, her line is very strong and healthy. I believe that if she receives good rest, away from her social and home duties, away from books and with good seaside air, she might make a full recovery in a week or less," the doctor continued. "I am sure you have heard of seaside resorts. There is an excellent one at the Isle of Wight, where I believe your mother would recover quite well. She would be treated with the utmost of care. At that point she will exit this state and become herself once more." A strange feeling consumed Mary as she watched the doctor speak. Words were seemingly coming out of his mouth, but to Mary they blended together in a string of mumbles. What was he saying? Mary knew nothing of this sort, nor had she read anything about it in her studies. She would trust the doctor, but she still felt the need to take heed. "If this is what you recommend, I must agree with your expertise," Mary replied hesitantly. "I shall have Miss Ramsbottom pack her bags. What will she require?" The doctor nodded. "Bring me some paper, and I will write down all that she may need. I would also advise that you accompany her to the resort. Good company ought to assist in her recovery. Is there someone who might attend to the house whilst you are away?" Mary walked over to the bureau and found a sheet of paper and a quill. She paused as the doctor began listing what Lady Elridge would need. "I believe that the housekeeper can handle everything as we are away." "Excellent," the doctor replied, handing back the list. "Please ensure this is assembled immediately, and a similar number of items for yourself. The sooner we leave, the sooner we arrive, and the sooner your mother shall begin to recover." Mary nodded and left to exit her mother's chambers. Mary knew full well Miss Ramsbottom and the other staff would be waiting outside with their ears to the door. She was right. "My mother is to go to the Isle of Wight. The doctor has recommended these items be prepared for her, and a similar luggage for myself. As I will accompany her, I am leaving the house under the watch of Miss Ramsbottom." The staff, realizing that Mary was now the highest authority in the house, bowed and curtsied before uttering their collective, "Yes, mistress," and set off to complete their errands from the list. Mary needed not correct the formality now. Mary returned to the room where the doctor was applying a watery tincture to Lady Elridge's forehead. Although she was making an effort to remain serene, her heart was thumping so hard her ribcage began to ache. She needed to be strong now for her mother, her father, her entire home. And yet she was utterly scared of what was to come. Chapter 6. Sitting in the coach, Mary was surprised that her mother could sit up. Sir Elridge sold the town coach 2 years prior, and at this moment Mary wished they still had it so her mother could be most comfortable. It had been a great trouble for Mary and the maid to dress Lady Elridge for the trip, but Mary refused to let her travel in her day clothes. She may be less than mentally capable right now, but it would be horrible if she discovered upon recovery that she had travelled in common day clothes. And now she sat in her coat and bonnet, staring out the open window. The doctor, sitting opposite, had insisted that the window be left open, as the air ought to help with recovery. Besides him, they were only accompanied by a single maid and the coach driver to assist with all their needs. Mary was still not comfortable being in a position of authority. Ordinarily, her mother would be, or her father would have come home to take over. In fact, she had hastily written to him and sent the letter immediately before leaving. But until he was able to help, Mary was the head of the house. Chills ran down her spine as thoughts of the worst flooded her mind. The journey to the resort was long, and Mary tried desperately to distract herself. However, she could not even bear to read on the way. She had far too much on her mind to be able to focus on a book. Above all, she was afraid for what might happen should her mother not recover. The doctor had said a week, but Mary did not know if he was sparing her heartache or telling the truth. Without her mother's wise guidance, she would not be ready to manage a home. Without that connection to the class above, her chances of marrying up would collapse. And above all, without her mother's unconditional love and support, she would be very much alone at home and in the world. So instead, for the first day, she simply sat and watched the scenery fly past. Then come nightfall, she laid and let exhaustion and worry consume her as she fell asleep. They decided to keep travelling through the night, changing horses every 6 hours until they got there, so as to ensure Lady Elridge received the treatment she required. They arrived at the port by nightfall on the 3rd day, long after the last ferry had departed. The doctor fortunately knew of a local inn. He could not stay the night at the same inn to accompany them to the resort in the morning, though. Instead, he made sure that they had some notes describing Lady Elridge's condition and his recommendations. And then he used their coach to return to town. Mary and the maid paid for their room, then helped Lady Elridge into her nightclothes and into bed. Mary herself could not sleep. Instead, she lay awake, wondering what would befall her mother. The next day, exhausted from a poor night's sleep, Mary barely felt ready to continue on their journey. But they were almost there. "I shall pack the bags myself. I would like you to go to the ferry and see if we can hire a worker to carry our luggage down," Mary told the maid, congratulating herself for keeping a straight head. Lady Elridge was still fast asleep in her bed, and secretly Mary hoped that her mother would awaken and be herself again, bright-eyed and ready to go home. But she had no such luck. Lady Elridge awoke with a sigh and continued staring at the ceiling, not moving from where she laid. "Come, Mother, we must get dressed," Mary insisted, producing a fresh dress from the bags and finding her mother's shoes, coat and bonnet at the dresser. "We are to continue to the Isle of Wight by ferry, and there you shall receive the care you need." Lady Elridge sighed again, and Mary realised that she and the maid would need to dress her mother once again. It broke her heart to see such a proud, strong woman in this state. When the maid returned, they dressed Lady Elridge and prepared the bags for the boy from the ferry to carry down. Mary had never been on a ferry before, but but she could not anticipate it with much excitement, not given the circumstances. Landing on the Isle of Wight, Mary was relieved to have her feet on solid ground. The ferry ride had made her quite nauseous, and the stress of worrying for her mother was making it even worse. She knew that they were mere minutes away from getting her mother the help she so desperately needed. To the right, down the beach, there was the village, with its little townhouses and beachfront stores. But they were headed across the beach and up the hill, towards a solitary manor overlooking the sea. The building itself had a fairly dull, flat face, and from where she was, Mary could see the outside beds reserved for patients with tubercular conditions. The curtains billowed in the open windows. She paid the boy from the ferry to find them a small carriage to transport all three of them, along with their luggage, up the hill. The coach was smaller than she had anticipated, and smelled of wine and salt, but it was better than nothing. "Soon we shall be there, Mother," she reassured Lady Elridge, holding her hand. "And I am sure that it will help. Why, you look so much more lively just for the change in air." The sharp chill and the salty mist were nothing like anything Mary had experienced before. Approaching the front gate was a woman dressed in white. She stood waiting for their coach. She was tall, with black hair, and a worn look on her face that suggested she was not old, but young and very tired. Mary assumed they had been spotted driving up to the manor, and someone had been sent to meet them. "Good morning. Are we expecting you?" the woman asked. Mary shook her head. "I do not believe so, but our doctor gave us this for you." She produced the letter and passed it to the woman, who took it, read it, and nodded to herself. "Very well. I am sure we have a bed in the recovery wing for your mother. Don't worry, she will be right as rain after a few days' rest," the woman finally said. "Just bring us on up to the front door," she instructed the coach driver as she stepped in alongside the other three women. "I am Nurse Cooper. I shall accompany you until a bed is located for your mother and a room for yourself, and then I will hand you over to the care of the chief physician, Dr. Miles Brooks. He ought to know just what to do." "Thank you ever so much," Mary replied with genuine heartfelt gratitude. "We see many such cases a year. All should be well once she has rested," Nurse Cooper reassured her. The building did not become any less bleak up close. The walls were a shade of off-grey, which suggested they had once been darker and more natural, but that the sea winds had worn them more than a little. The garden was kept tidy, but without much in the way of flowers or topiary. The curtains billowing in the windows were all white, and much of the staff was also dressed in white. The entire place had an air of being sanitary, which Mary liked, but it also felt rather lifeless. Her mother found a bed in a small room of her own with a large open window overlooking the beach. Mary wondered whether the wind might be a little too cold, but decided not to question the treatment methods. After all, this was a professional institution that had been in operation for decades. They knew what was best for their patients. Mary also had a room. It was facing inward towards the island, with all the niceties a young woman of her stature deserved, and none of the limitations which the patients needed. Apparently it was not uncommon for women to be accompanied by daughters, daughters-in-law, mothers or sisters during their stay at the facility. So in the women's area, there was an entire wing dedicated to family who wished to stay. Having unpacked her bags, Mary decided she needed a walk and some fresh air to help her regain her strength from the journey. After all, it had been an emotional and physically intense couple of days. She still felt completely overwhelmed. Walking in the garden at the manor was not at all like walking in any garden she knew back home. It was more like a park, with open grassy areas and a few, not particularly decorative, trees. The flower beds were largely bare, and there were no lawn ornaments of any kind. But a walk was a walk. Mary made her way down to the very bottom of the garden, where a small fence stopped her from advancing any further. A few feet past the fence there was a sharp slope, too steep to walk on, leading down to the beach. She paused there and looked out over the water, at the line of the mainland in the distance. "Well, I certainly did not expect to see you here," a man's voice said behind her. "Mr. Duke Haskett?" She gasped. Surely I'm having some kind of a vision. How is it you are here? He laughed. I would very much like to ask you the same thing, he replied. I assumed I had escaped your family's reach, and yet here you are. My mother has taken ill. The doctor recommended a stay here, Mary replied. Now it is your turn. Something about me for something about you. An old friend of mine is here for her rheumatism, he said, and she is of the sort to be dramatic, I suppose you could say. Her parents asked me to come and reassure her that she will be all right, and see to it that she receives everything she needs until she can make a full recovery, he explained. She? Mary asked. There was a flutter of uncertainty in her voice. I assure you she is but a friend. I would not be dishonest with you if she were another candidate to become my wife, he replied. Mary nodded. I have no option but to trust you. She looked around. I believe it would be best for us to return to the house. It is not proper for us to be here together. Duke Haskett looked around too and nodded in agreement. Indeed, I thought there were more people here. Do go on ahead. Shall we meet at the tea rooms in half an hour? Mary smiled and curtsied. I should like that very much. At the very least, it would be a breakaway from her worries. Or even better, it may be a way of persuading her mother that all was well with the Duke. The tea rooms were open to both guests and patients, but as it was mid-morning, most patients were in the wards receiving a variety of treatments, tinctures, seawater, leeches and baths. So the tea rooms were virtually empty other than a table where some nurses sat talking quietly and sipping tea, and there was one table where a smartly dressed man was reading a newspaper. Mary felt a little self-conscious sitting down on her own, but comforted herself with the thought that soon she would have polite company with her. And what a relief that Duke Haskett was simply visiting a friend. It ought to put her mother's mind at ease, which should help her recover from the shock. When Duke Haskett arrived, it seemed both of them had been thinking along the same lines. Hello again, Mary. I hate to change plans yet again, but it has crossed my mind that your mother may be pleased to see me and know that you are both in good company. Mary nodded. I was having just the same thought myself. Excellent. I must ask you to lead the way, he replied. When they arrived, Lady Elridge was sitting up in her bed, looking out the window at the sparkling sea, seeming serene, but rather sad too. When she turned to see who had come in through the door, a change came over her. Her eyes lit up and she smiled softly. Oh, your Grace, Mr. Haskett, how nice of you to visit, she said. Mary felt her eyes water up and rushed to her mother's bedside, taking her hand and squeezing it firmly. It's wonderful. That's the first she's said since the fall, she explained. How are you feeling? Lady Elridge shook her head slowly. Tired, very tired. But I shall recover, and it is so nice to know that you are in good company whilst you wait. I am very sorry to see you in this condition, Lady Elridge, Duke Haskett said, and I shall pray for your speedy recovery. He looked from Lady Elridge to Mary and back again. I believe that you shall like some time in privacy. Shall we all reunite in the tea rooms at 5? That sounds splendid, replied Lady Elridge, squeezing Mary's hand. We shall see you then. Duke Haskett left the room, softly closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Mary flung her arms around her mother's neck and held her close. I am so glad you are feeling better. I was so worried for you. She buried her face in her mother's shoulder and choked back a sob. You scared me. Lady Elridge ran her fingers over Mary's hair slowly and softly, shushing her. All will be well, especially now I know that your suitor is here. Mary looked up at her mother's face. How so? Mary. I was so upset to find out he had left. I assumed you might have done something to insult him, or to make him somehow reconsider. But now I can see he is still interested, she beamed. I no longer have any cause to be distressed. But what brings him here? You did not tell him of my incident, surely. Mary shook her head. Not at all. He is here seeing a friend of his family's, a lady being treated for rheumatism. An old lady? Lady Elridge asked. Mary shook her head again, then reconsidered. Well, truthfully, I do not know. He simply said he was here to reassure her, as she is a bit dramatic. Lady Elridge pursed her lips and looked out the window. Mary, did a maid come with us? Mary nodded. Yes, Susie. Call her in. I have a job for her, Lady Elridge replied. I wish for her to find out who this woman is, how old she is, and the exact nature of her relationship to Mr. Haskett. Mary was slightly taken aback. But, Mother, that sounds most unnecessary. I do believe it is the illness speaking, and not yourself. Mary, do not question me. Should this woman be a potential candidate for marriage to him, or of a class above ours, she is a threat to your chances. I must know. Now send for Susie. Chapter 7. Mary was still hesitant. I do not believe that we should be making such decisions now, she argued. You are in recovery from some quite serious shock. It is possible that you are not making this decision in a proper state of mind. I am most certainly making this decision in a proper state of mind, Mary. Your future depends on us knowing who this woman is, Lady Elridge replied. And should she be another young lady he is seeing? Mary asked. It is not as though we could do anything. We can compete, Lady Elridge insisted. If we know who she is, what she has to offer, then perhaps we can compete. She took her daughter's hand and squeezed it tightly. I only do this for your good. I want you to succeed, to marry up, to live well, she said. Mary sighed. She felt she lived well enough. But it was not up to her how she was to live, who she was to marry, or indeed whether or not Susie was sent to spy on Duke Haskett. Very well, I shall find her, Mary said. Susie was sitting on her bed in the dormitory which the servants shared, brushing her spare dress down. My mother wants to see you, Mary said. Susie curtsied. Is she well, mistress? Mary shook her head. I am not sure, but she wishes to see you. Susie followed Mary back to Lady Elridge's room, where she was back to staring out the window, lost in thought. She brightened up as soon as she saw Mary and Susie were back. Mary closed the door behind them. Susie, I have some important work for you, Lady Elridge began. Now this is a most confidential matter. You are not to relay any of it to anyone, and you must exercise the utmost discretion. Can you manage this? Susie nodded. I shall attempt to. Good. Now I have heard that Mr. Haskett is here visiting a friend of his family, a lady friend, and it is in my interests to discover who exactly this lady is and what she means to him, Lady Elridge explained. You must find out her name, where she is staying, what exactly her ailment is, and whether or not she is vying to marry Mr. Haskett. Susie curtsied. I shall do my very best. Good girl. There is a handsome reward in it for you, should you succeed, Lady Elridge concluded. Now time is of the essence. Of course, mistress, Susie replied, curtsying to Lady Elridge, then turning to Mary to also give a curtsy and a mistress before leaving the room. Mary shook her head. We should not be doing this, he said she was a friend. And that is exactly what he would say, were he courting a young woman in a place like this, away from her family's supervision, her mother replied. I refuse to believe he would lie to me, Mary insisted. Mary, men lie, Lady Elridge replied sternly. Men love to lie because men love to do as they ought not. You must learn this and accept it, because once you have come to terms with man's nature, you shall be in a much better position to act and react accordingly. Whatever do you mean? Mary asked, sitting down on the edge of her mother's bed. That when it comes to men, they will lie to us, and if we can detect and demystify these lies, we can make sure that they do not hurt us, she explained, holding her daughter's hand. Surely not. I mean, has father ever— Mary began. Lady Elridge shook her head. Such matters are private. You shall learn in good time. A knock rang at the door. Before they could ask, it swung open and Susie entered. "Is it good news or bad?" Lady Elridge asked. "I am not sure," Susie replied, closing the door behind her as she caught her breath. "Go on then, out with it," Lady Elridge insisted. "I do not know much as of yet, but I have found out where she is staying and who she is," Susie panted. "She is a young woman of around 17, perhaps 18, daughter to Baron and Baroness Langley, named Kitty. She suffers with her joints, so she has been sent here for the sea air to ease the swelling." "Is she wed or betrothed?" Lady Elridge asked. Susie shook her head. "She is not wed. I have not had the time to find out if she is engaged." "Please keep a close eye on her," Lady Elridge concluded. "We need to know as much as possible." As Susie left and the door clicked shut behind her, Mary could hardly believe it. She shook her head. "I am sure it is nothing. He said she is just a friend of the family." "Mary, men will lie so long as it is in their best interests to lie," Lady Elridge replied. "I believe you have already found out who Mr. Haskett actually is." Mary nodded and avoided making eye contact. "Antoinette found out and told me." "Well, then I am sure you understand why a young daughter of a baron may be serious competition for you," her mother explained. "After all, he would be making a big step down in marrying you." "Would he?" Mary asked nervously. "It is my title that would change, not his." Lady Elridge nodded. "That is very true, and it is possible that we are wrong and that his relationship to this girl is wholly innocent. But we cannot assume such things. We must know." "Perhaps we ought to confront him," Mary suggested. Lady Elridge paused thoughtfully. "We must find out more. If this girl really is a simple friend of the family, if she is betrothed to someone else perhaps, then we do not want to appear rude. We need to wait for Susie to find out more." "And until then?" Mary asked. "Until then you must be charming, civil, and above all, present. The more time he spends with you, the less time he will spend with that woman, and the more likely he is to choose you above her. Provided that you are charming, that is." Mary nodded. It did not feel right to be acting like this behind Duke Haskett's back. But she knew that it meant very much to her mother for her to possibly marry a duke. And she also knew that her mother's reasons for wanting Mary to marry up had to be valid. Lady Elridge had experienced marrying down, and all it entailed, she knew the differences between the classes and how Mary might live as Duchess of York. And yet, Mary still felt as though they were doing something terribly, horribly wrong. She had been raised a good Christian girl, and she was pretty sure that good Christian girls did not send their servants to spy on men and their whereabouts. But then again, had Duke Haskett lied to her, then would they not be equal? And had he lied to her, would she not want to know? She sighed. The adult world was complicated and confusing, but there was no turning back. She was about to ask her mother whether or not it would be wise to continue courtship with a man who had lied about such a serious matter. At that moment there was another knock at the door, bolder and clearly a man. Mary held her breath and braced herself to avoid any confrontation which could arise from the tensions. "Come in," she said. But it was not Duke Haskett. It was a small, slender man of about 50, with fading blonde hair and piercing green eyes. His lips were thin and dry, and his face was pockmarked and slightly flaky in appearance. "Dr. Brooks, what a lovely surprise," Lady Elridge said. "Have you met my daughter?" "Even more talkative yet, Lady Elridge," the physician remarked. "You are making fantastic improvement from your condition when you arrived. The sea air must have been just the thing." He turned to Mary and looked at her with an amount of surprise which suggested she had appeared on the spot, rather than been there the whole time. "Miss Elridge, I presume? Lovely to meet you. As you can see, your doctor was quite right to send your mother our way, and she is making an astonishing recovery." "What does that mean?" Lady Elridge asked, sounding a little concerned. "That you may be able to return home in as little as 2 more days," Dr. Brooks replied. Often it can take a week or more for a woman to recover from this type of dementia at this early stage. I must commend your good health." Lady Elridge smiled. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks." The smile seemed to persuade Dr. Brooks that she was well, but Mary knew otherwise. She could tell that her mother was distressed. The doctor took her pulse and a sample which had been collected that morning by a nurse. He made sure that enough air was entering the room, and with a polite nod he left to continue his rounds. "Well, we cannot have that," she said to Mary as soon as the doctor had left. "Cannot have what?" Mary asked. "I cannot return home. Not until we know who this Miss Kitty Langley is, and what her relationship to Duke Haskett may be," Lady Elridge said with a sigh. "Fortune giveth and taketh away. We must make good use of our remaining time here." Mary still did not feel it was the right thing to do, but she also knew that arguing with her mother would get her absolutely nowhere. "I shall talk a little to Duke Haskett. I shall be careful and subtle. But you must bring him to me that I may find out more about his intentions with this Kitty Langley girl," Lady Elridge insisted. Mary nodded. "He said he shall meet us for tea at the tea rooms, so perhaps then will be our opportunity." Lady Elridge shook her head. "No, it is too public. We must persuade him to see us after tea, perhaps for a walk in the garden." "Can you walk?" Mary asked hesitantly. Lady Elridge looked down at her legs. She moved a foot tentatively, but she was clearly too proud to admit that her legs were feeling too weak to walk. Mary nodded. "I shall find you a chair. I believe I saw some patients in wheelchairs, so perhaps they have a spare one." Lady Elridge smiled in the way she did when she was thankful and indignant at once. Tea with Duke Haskett was slightly delayed until he arrived, approximately 10 minutes late. "Terribly sorry, but my friend was having one of her moments and insisted that I stay and listen to the end of her story. The rest here does such wonders for her, but she cannot be without company or a book for long before she is aching to do something," he explained. Lady Elridge nodded. "Indeed. I did not know that young women can suffer rheumatism," she began. Duke Haskett shook his head. "Many assume that it is an affliction of the elderly, and yet she has had it since she was a little girl. It's very sad." Lady Elridge replied. "Have you known her since she was young?" Mary asked, attempting to keep the mood light. "Oh yes, she and I used to play together all the time. Our parents were close friends, and both of us are only children, so despite how young she was, and that she was a girl, I felt compelled to play with her when we visited." He had a faraway smile, and he shook his head gently as though dismissing those memories. "But when I became a man of some power, and she was starting to become a young lady, it was thought improper for us to see each other as much. I seldom see her except at times like these, when she needs company and has nobody by her side." He picked up his tea and sipped it, eyeing the platter of cucumber sandwiches behind the teapot. Mary moved the teapot so that he could reach the tray. "Can her parents not visit her?" "Or a female friend," added Lady Elridge. He raised an eyebrow. "Why? Is there anything the matter with the present arrangement?" He took a sandwich and bit into it, making careful eye contact with Lady Elridge. It was not a look so much as a warning. "Well," said Lady Elridge, "it's only a little odd. For a man such as yourself, an unattached man, to be seeing a young lady, unattended. I am sure you understand." He swallowed his bite. "We are not unattended. This is a public facility, and there are nurses and servants around at all times. Still, especially when you are courting Mary," Lady Elridge continued.
Before we continue into the story, make us a favor. Hit the subscribe button. This way we will be able to create more audiobooks for free for you. Thank you again. Now, back to our story.
"I am courting many women at present, Lady Elridge. Not Kitty by any means. She is a sister to me. But were she not, and were I courting her also, I would have been honest with you," he insisted. "And yet you were dishonest about who you are," Mary said without thinking. She covered her mouth with a hand. "Pardon me, I don't know what." It is fine. It is for this purpose that I am courting so many young women. It so happens that a man of my stature attracts many of a certain type of parent and girl. I wish to avoid such people. Right now, you are both making it abundantly clear what sort of people you are." He swallowed another mouthful of tea. "And what type of person would that be?" Lady Elridge asked indignantly. Duke Haskett leaned in and spoke quietly. "The type of person who thinks only of herself, who does not consider me a human being but a step on the ladder of social status and a handsome income, who is willing to stop at nothing to rectify her own marriage, which she, at great insult to her hard-working husband, considers a mistake. That type of person, Lady Elridge." Lady Elridge stared on in shock, her face turning a bright shade of crimson. "Mary, my salts, please," she whispered. Duke Haskett stood up, dusted down his coat and smiled at the two women. "Have a good day, Lady Elridge, Miss Elridge, and a good life." Chapter 8. Mary felt strange as she accompanied her mother back to the room. She was not quite sure where to place her emotions or her thoughts. It was as though some dark veil had been dropped upon her and was clouding her mind. Lady Elridge was not much better. She had returned to a state where she did not speak, only held her salts and stared forward, absorbed in her own mind. Looking at her mother, Mary felt a pang of anger towards Duke Haskett. He may have been right. Lady Elridge did consider status, but Duke Haskett should have known that she was there for her nerves and not to upset her like that. And now her condition was nearly as bad as before. The physician, Dr. Brooks, spotted Mary wheeling Lady Elridge up the hallway and followed them into her room, where he took her pulse, checked her pupils, and attempted to talk to her. Then he rolled her up to the window, where she could get as much air as possible. "Will she be all right, Dr. Brooks?" Mary asked nervously. Dr. Brooks nodded. "She is nowhere near as bad as she was when she was brought here first. However, she has most definitely suffered a shock," he confirmed. "What may have caused this?" Mary shook her head. "We had lunch with a friend and then she was like this." Dr. Brooks looked Lady Elridge up and down. "It is possible that in her frail state even socializing is too much effort for her. I would advise that you talk to her as little as possible, and only about pleasantries." "Will she recover then?" Mary asked. "Of course she will, dear. It is but a small setback to her recovery. In fact, I see no reason why she should not be speaking right now, and I am sure she will once the initial shock wears off." The doctor packed away his tools and proceeded to leave the room. "At any rate, I believe that my presence alone may be altogether too stimulating. Please call me as soon as you notice an improved or worsened condition. Otherwise, I shall ask staff that Lady Elridge not be disturbed." Mary knew it. She knew when the doctor first told her of this illness, and she felt the same churn in her stomach now. Her mother was not recovering as quickly as originally said. Her heart began to ache as she remembered the last few conversations she had with her mother. She replayed every word slowly in her mind, relishing the way her mother offered advice and guided her. Mary hadn't appreciated her then, cutting her mother off and arguing incessantly, but she certainly appreciated those words now. As soon as the doctor left, Mary sat down in the chair by the window, facing her mother's wheelchair. "The doctor says you are not as bad as before," she said with a faint smile. And yet Lady Elridge just stared out the window. Oh, Mother, how could he be so insensitive? And yet, she did not hate him for it. She was angry at that one action, that one moment of cruelty. But it had not tarred her impression of the man. He was still a good man. He was put in a difficult position. She understood his distress. He wished to marry a genuinely good woman, and all he was witnessing was feigned interest and exaggerated civility in an effort to seduce him. She would be angry at being treated in such a manner as well. Mary sighed. The strange feeling was only getting worse. She wondered whether she had developed an attraction to Duke Haskett above and beyond what was expected of a young woman meeting a suitor. She tried to tell herself that she had not, but she knew she had. She knew that she felt genuine love for him. She knew what she needed to do. She needed to apologize to Duke Haskett. Not for herself, or to improve her chances of marrying him, although were he to reconsider her, she would be glad to be courted by him once again. No, she needed to apologize to him because it was the decent thing to do. He deserved to be treated with more respect. Her mother had acted in a manner which had insulted and seemingly hurt him. It took some time to find him. She had checked by Miss Kitty Langley's quarters, at the tea rooms, and even asked at the reception whether he had departed. Eventually she found him at the bottom of the garden, leaning on the fence, watching the wind raising waves and foam across the sea. The sun was setting slowly, tinting the sky pink, and the sea air was sharp and cold. Mary knew she ought not be out there alone with a man, but she reassured herself that there were enough people in the garden that it would not be suspicious. Besides, apologizing to him mattered more to her than her own dignity at this point. Everything about him mattered more. "Duke Haskett," Mary said tentatively, "I have no more to say to you." He sounded somewhat melancholy, as though he shared her feelings. This emboldened her. "I simply wish to apologize for mine and my mother's behavior," she insisted. He sighed. "I suppose an apology is due from me also. I accept your apology. Will you accept my sincerest apology for how I conducted myself at tea?" "I will, and I hope my mother does also," Mary curtsied, then walked up to the fence. "I only wish you could forgive me enough to give me another opportunity." "How am I to trust you? Ever since you discovered my identity, you have been peculiar," he replied. "It is always the same story. I meet a lovely young lady and she seems ideal. Then I overhear her talking behind my back about how much money she will get from me." He shook his head. "The world is rotten, Miss Elridge. But I do feel that you and we were meant to be." Mary tried to express her emotions, but words failed her. He shook his head. "No, I am sorry. I have heard such words come from the mouths of 1,000 serpents. I believed you and your mother were good, honest women, but that belief appears to have been incorrect. I may not be very good, and my mother may not be very honest. But I am being honest when I tell you that you are important to me," she insisted. "Miss Elridge, find yourself someone of your status. Only then will you know if you are marrying well or not." He turned about and walked back up to the manor. Mary could not even bear to look back upon him. She felt a tear travel down her cheek. It was only after several more minutes of watching the sea that she ventured back indoors and found her mother's room once again. Susie had helped Lady Elridge into her bedclothes, and she was fast asleep when Mary looked in on her. Feeling mournful and sleepless, Mary requested a candle from a nurse, returned to her own room and procured a book from her bag. She could not even focus on the words. Mary knew at this point that her family's chances of marrying her up were slim to none. And yet, she did not care. She did not care if she married down, to a doctor or a member of the military. What sort of a man she would marry no longer mattered to her. All that mattered was that it would not be Duke Haskett. Despite the setback, Lady Elridge slowly continued to recover. The doctors were again impressed with her strong constitution and speedy recovery, and she was to be discharged by that week's end. In the meantime, a letter finally arrived from Mary's father, explaining that he had only just received Mary's letter, as well as the notes from the physician, and that he would endeavour to be home for when they arrived. Lady Elridge, during her time in that locked-in state, had plenty of time to think about her daughter's circumstance. "Mary, it pains me to say this, but we cannot dwell upon the past. Duke Haskett would have been a good match for you, and yet now there is no possibility of that marriage taking place," she explained as Susie packed their bags. "Therefore we must persevere. We cannot waste time hoping for a man who will not return. You will not grow any younger. We must find another man of status for you to wed." And yet Mary did not wish for any other man, only for Duke Haskett. She would never say so to her mother. No, that would cause too much pain to them both. She would have to wear a brave face and carry on, and hope that these feelings would pass before she found another suitor. The trip back home was tense. Mary attempted to bring up Duke Haskett's apology, but her mother would not even speak of him. Her mother wished to talk about other potential suitors, but Mary insisted she was not ready. Instead, they sat in silence for most of the first day. That night they stopped to rest at an inn where Lady Elridge purchased herself some tools for needlework. She sewed and Mary read for the remainder of their journey, which felt at once as though it passed in the blink of an eye, and yet somehow lasted years. They only arrived back home at nightfall. Sir Elridge was not yet home, but the housekeeper had made the beds, prepared a light supper, and lit the fires to welcome mother and daughter. They ate well and were soon ready to sleep. "Do not worry," Mary's mother assured her as she settled down, in her own bed at last. "You will find a wonderful man to marry." Mary sighed. "I do hope so, mother. I wish to make you proud." Lady Elridge stroked Mary's hair. "You do, Mary. You make me so proud." She kissed her daughter's head softly and stood up. "I only hope that someday I may make you proud also." And with that, she took the candle and left the room. Mary felt too sore to play the pianoforte the next morning. Her body ached from the trip, but her heart was aching also. She knew she had to recover, to come back stronger than before. This was only her first suitor, and there would be many more young men who would be interested. Probably many more whom she would like or love. And yet, she pined for Duke Haskett. Mary was so indisposed that Lady Elridge sent for the doctor, but even he could not find a solution. He concluded that she simply needed good female company to help her vent her emotions, which were bottling up inside her and causing her pain. So, Lady Elridge then sent for the one person Mary spoke freely to, Antoinette. "I understand that you are unhappy at losing Duke Haskett as a suitor," Antoinette said, gently stroking her cousin's shoulder as they sat beside each other. "But you must go on. There are many suitors I have lost whom I have held affection for. But if it is not to be, it is not to be." "But what if there was a mistake?" Mary asked. "What if it was meant to be?" "The good Lord does not make mistakes, Mary. All that has happened, hurt though it may, serves a purpose of some kind," Antoinette reassured her. Mary sighed. I wish I could prove to him that I want him for himself, and not for his money." She rested her head on Antoinette's shoulder. "To clear your name?" Antoinette asked. Mary shook her head. "I do not know what for. It does not matter to me if others believe I desired his money. People shall gossip, and those who know me know better. I simply want him to know." Antoinette nodded. "I understand what you mean, but there is nothing you can do now. Your father will be home tonight. I am sure that will please you." Mary felt genuinely uplifted at the prospect of seeing her father. He had never been very present in her life, but whenever he was home for a while, the quality of time they spent together more than made up for the weeks he spent away. She knew that even if he could not comfort her, he could perhaps offer some distraction in the form of tales from his work and trinkets from his travels. She sat up by the dining room fireplace late that night waiting for him. She did everything she could to stay awake. She read, she paced, but her eyelids grew heavy, and at the stroke of one, she retired to rest. Descending for breakfast, Mary could smell a faint waft of cigar smoke. She could tell it was her father's usual cigar from the odour alone, and she rushed down the remaining stairs and into the drawing room, her face lit up with joy. "Father, you're back," she said with a broad smile. "Ah, Mary, I have some wonderful news for you, but you must wait until your mother is here." Sir Elridge puffed at his cigar. "Do sit down. Begin your breakfast." Mary nodded and sat down, but she barely had any appetite. Instead, she relayed some details of their stay at the Isle of Wight, as her father told her about the things he had seen in London, including, of all things, a circus with acrobatic animals. Mary listened in awe until she heard her mother's sharp footsteps entering the drawing-room. "Excellent," Sir Elridge said, smiling at Lady Elridge. "Now that we are all here, I can tell you both the good news. Do sit down, my love." He waved at Lady Elridge's seat. Once everyone was seated and had served themselves food, he put out his cigar in the ashtray by his plate and cleared his throat. "Having heard of what had occurred with Duke Haskett, all that I could think of was how sad my lovely daughter would be," he began. "So I took it upon myself to find her another suitor. It was not entirely by design, I must admit. But a friend of mine in London has a son who is just dying to get married, and I believe he will be an excellent fit. You will be meeting him tomorrow." Mary, who had been chewing a mouthful of food, simply stared. There was a creak of furniture and the clatter of a spoon hitting the ground as Lady Elridge fainted in her chair. Chapter 9. Lady Elridge regained consciousness in a chair by the window. Sir Elridge seemed to slowly realise he had done something unexpected, inappropriate, or both. Mary herself was completely and utterly flabbergasted. But she also knew that it was not her place to start asking questions about these things and defy her parents. Besides, judging by her mother's reaction, she knew she had at least one person on her side in this battle. If she waited, hopefully she would see a resolution that would make some sense to her. For now, she just had to test her patience. Until Mary's mother awoke, became alert and started speaking, Mary realised this would be a battle she had to fight on her own. "I appreciate what you're doing, James," her mother began, "and I put my complete trust in you to make the right choice for our daughter. That said, I require some form of explanation to ease my nerves. This is quite sudden." Sir Elridge nodded. "I understand that it is. However, I believe that swift action is necessary. Our daughter is old enough to be married and presently has one suitor whose rejection has left her in some considerable anguish. I believe that exposure to a new suitor could prove to her that there is an abundance of worthy young men eager to wed her. If this young man is of interest to her, then all is well. And if he is not, then this new exposure may help inspire courage and confidence in her." Sir Elridge's speech, however passionate, fell short for both Mary and her mother. Mary did not like the suggestion that she simply needed to discover that more men existed. She knew that more men existed, and would rather be paired up with one who would stand to make a content and respectable wife of her. Her mother had a different complaint. "But our daughter needs to marry a man with a certain status, with connections," Lady Elridge insisted. "She will marry well," Sir Elridge countered. "But—" Lady Elridge trailed off. "Never mind. I shall give some thought to what you have said, James." Mary knew what her mother meant. She had heard her mother speak like this before, although she was much younger, and the topic was not about men. It was about pianoforte lessons. That was the tone of voice her mother used when what she really meant to say was, "Not in front of the child, but I shall give you a piece of my mind when we are in private." It struck Mary how frustrated her mother must be. Lady Elridge was the daughter of a baron who had given up her quality of life to marry down. And now, despite being more educated, noble and socially influential than her husband, she was forced to defer to him, even when it came to protecting her own daughter from the same fate. At least if Mary married her equal, or slight superior, she would always know that her husband was making informed, wise decisions. It would be easy to respect, follow and love a man who knew what he was doing. But her poor mother could neither count on her husband, nor have the last say in matters. She was trapped. But then one question remained. Why was an equal marriage also out of the question? Mary was the daughter of a knight, not a baron. She did not need to marry a baron or above to have a more educated husband she could trust and respect. In that aspect, she had to admit that her mother's intentions for her were covetous. "What do you think, Mary, my sweet?" her father asked, casting her the slightly pleading gaze of a father who had only wanted to look after his daughter. If you believe he is an upstanding young man, and you would be happy to see him take my hand in marriage, I shall see him, Mary said, but she couldn't manage to make eye contact with her parents. Sir Elridge breathed a sigh of relief. He truly is a wonderful young man, Mary. It is possible that the two of you will be highly compatible. Mary nodded. I look forward to meeting him. That night, Mary awoke with a sense that something was occurring in the normally quiet building. She could hear the murmur of voices, despite the clock telling her it was well past midnight, when most of the servants and her parents would usually be in bed. She slipped on a housecoat, took her candle, and crept down the hallway towards the source of the sounds, her parents' room. As she had suspected, away from the judging eyes of society, her mother had summoned the courage to turn against her father. Our daughter will not marry some Spaniard, she said. She must marry an upstanding Englishman, with connections, with status, not someone who is yet to make his fortune. Enrique de Sevilla is a respectable young man of noble blood, Sir Elridge replied, and she would do well to marry him? Do well? I do not hear people of worth speaking his name. I do not see lines of young women aspiring to be his wife. He may be a man of worth in Spain, but he is nobody in this country. And yet you say our daughter would do well? To marry a nobody? Lady Elridge was losing her breath again. Her face was red, and she collapsed into her chair, where she waved the salts under her nose, trying desperately to regain her focus. Dear, please don't overexert yourself, Sir Elridge said, lowering himself onto one knee by her chair, and with his handkerchief, blotting the sweat from her forehead. Not in your condition. Lady Elridge drew a deep breath, then another one, and finally sighed. I want what is best for the girl, James. I truly love you. But this is not the life I would have chosen. This is not the life I was used to. And I may be happy to lead this life now, but she deserves so much more. She deserves to taste the life I gave up for you. Sir Elridge nodded. And I understand that. But we must remain realistic. She is still young now, but she won't be forever. And your health is no longer strong enough that you can continue fretting about her destiny. It is essential that I take over and give her the time and opportunity to find a suitor worth marrying. After a brief pause, Mary could hear her mother sobbing and her father shushing her. Mary felt uncomfortable about what she had overheard, especially since it left more questions than answers. She had been curious as to what her mother was going to say, but now she wished she hadn't been. She crept back up the hallway and into her bedroom, but she could not sleep all night. The next day preparations were underway to welcome the de Sevilla family, which, with the serious lack of staff, naturally meant that everyone was very busy, and Mary could do nothing without feeling that she was getting under someone's feet. So she withdrew to the garden, finding her childhood swing tied to the sturdy branches of an apple tree. After ensuring it had not been too badly affected by the elements, she sat down and lightly rocked herself back and forth, looking out over the garden. She was starting to feel like a terrible burden to her family. Finding her a good suitor was proving hard, and she was now convinced that it was driving her parents to argue, possibly to hate one another. They were having to invest so much time and money into these arranged meetings, and her mother's health was suffering more than she had thought, all probably due to the burden Mary was placing on her. And yet the only way to stop being a burden on them would be to marry, and marry well. If she could marry a good man who would command her respect, take good care of her, and uphold strong Christian values, then she could fix this. They would no longer need to argue, spend their money, or risk their health for her. Hello. It was a boyish voice with a severe accent. Mary turned her head to face the young man. He was slightly shorter than her, with thick black hair firmly waxed down to frame his innocent face. But his clothes attracted her attention the most. He was wearing tight, glossy trousers, several layers on top, and a flat, wide-brimmed hat that looked to Mary more like a bonnet than menswear. His eyes frantically searched the space for something to fixate on. I do not know what I am doing, But my parents said I should be talking to you, so I am, he explained. Without an escort? Mary asked. Escort? He asked back. This made Mary even more confused. Who hadn't heard of an escort? She shook her head. We should not be talking alone out here. Come, let us go indoors. The young man nodded. I am Enrique, by the way. And I am Marianne, she replied with a soft smile. She has no desire to introduce herself with her nickname. At this point in time, that felt too intimate. She felt no pull towards him, no true interest. But if marrying him could stop her from being a burden to her family, then she would do her best to impress him. You speak excellent English, she managed to say as they walked indoors. He nodded. I have to. Back at home, my father has many international duties, which I may someday take over. Mary nodded politely back. Inside, she found their parents talking in the withdrawing room. Enrique's father was dressed similarly to his son, but it was his mother who made Mary gasp. Although Mary and her mother dressed in the usual Parisian styles that were all the rage, Mary was immediately struck by the unique stylings of Lady de Seville's dress. It was boldly red instead of soft pastel and heavily decorated with black trim and lace. The skirts were bustled high, unlike Mary's own lower bustle and slimmer contour, and the fabric was heavy. She was adorned from head to toe in pearls. Mary felt conflicted about this strange appearance. On the one hand, she found such a style to be daring, unique, and immensely beautiful. On the other hand, she knew full well that even the Germans wore the latest fashion straight from Paris. And looking to her mother, she could tell that Lady Elridge was not hugely impressed by this deviation from the norm. Her lips were pursed, and although she smiled and chatted politely, Mary could tell that she was judging these strange Spanish people and their fanciful clothes. Mary understood the warning. Even though different nations had different fashions, it was through clothing that one could tell who someone was. Their rank, their wealth, whether they had inherited or made their fortune. All of these things could be picked apart from how someone dressed. And yet these people, they were not readable. Their clothes said nothing to Mary or her mother. As the adults spoke, Mary and Enrique stood by the window, and Mary wondered what to talk about. Do you play? She finally asked. Enrique gave her a blank stare. Any instruments? Enrique shuffled his foot. A little guitar, a little pianoforte, he replied. Mary smiled with relief. Oh, I also play. This arrangement may not be so bad if they had the same interests. How do you find it? I'm not too fond of it. Mary's shoulders fell. Oh, well, what do you like? Bullfighting, Enrique replied with a broad smile. Bullfighting? Mary asked, trying to hide the horror in her voice. A man uses a cape to draw the attention of a raging bull, and then he and other men use weapons to wear it down, ending when the beast is slain by sword, Enrique expanded. It is a very masculine and powerful sport. Many ladies faint. It does sound rather barbaric, she thought, curious. Sometimes the fighters die. That is sad, Enrique replied. Mary's eyes bulged and she nodded. There wasn't really anything she had in common with this young man, but her father wanted her to try her best, and try her best she would. After all, she had to stop being a burden to them. She noticed her mother calling her aside and practically leapt at the opportunity to escape. I am so sorry. My mother wishes to speak. Please make yourself at home. She curtsied and then followed her mother out of the drawing room into the front room. Marianne, her mother began, what do you think of Enrique de Sevilla? Mary drew a deep breath. I am sure he is quite lovely once one gets to know him, she insisted. Her mother was hesitant. Of course, she eventually replied with the weary voice of a woman resigning herself to fate. Shall we invite them to dinner? Mary nodded. I believe that could be enjoyable. Their eyes met. Both could tell that the other was not at all happy with this situation. and yet both could tell that the other was determined to see it through. Mary did so as to not encumbrance her parents. Mary's heart ached and begged her to hug her mother, cry and say she did not want to marry Enrique, not now or ever, or anyone like him. She wanted to say that she would wait for someone appropriate and trust her mother, and try to be a good daughter and not a burden to them. But she knew a lady did not cry and beg and defy her parents. She would go through with this, if this is what it took to make them happy and liberate them from the pain she was causing them. Walking back into the room, Lady Elridge approached Lady de Sevilla and curtsied. "I would like to invite you to dinner," she said. Lady de Sevilla curtsied also. "I am most grateful, but we must decline," she replied. Lady Elridge looked to the two men. "We have been speaking," Sir Elridge said, "and we have concluded that Marianne and Enrique, though both wonderful children, are not a suitable couple for one another. Their marriage would not be satisfactory or successful for either of them. I believe that my son would be much happier to marry a Spanish girl," Lord de Sevilla explained. "We need to see a passion between a couple before we allow them to marry, or else the marriage will not be successful. Thus far, English girls have not been of interest to him, so we shall look back home." Lady Elridge looked as though she was not sure whether to be relieved or insulted. Mary had hoped her mother did not want this courtship to go forward in the first place. But now that it was them deciding against it, Mary did not know what her parents were thinking. Lady Elridge nodded and forced a smile. "I am pleased with your decision," she said, not sounding at all pleased. "Now, I must make some arrangements for dinner." She left the room obviously quite flustered. Mary curtsied to the de Sevillas and followed after her mother. Chapter 10. Mary saw her mother sitting in an armchair in the corner of her room. She looked suddenly worn, old beyond her years, and so very, very tired. Mary knocked lightly on the open door. "Come in," Lady Elridge replied. Mary walked over to the chair and perched herself daintily on the arm of it, before wrapping an arm around her mother's shoulder. "Father is right. There shall be more suitors," Mary said quietly. Lady Elridge smiled meekly. "More like Duke Haskett, or more like Mr. Enrique de Sevilla?" "Neither, I hope," Mary laughed a little. "I would much prefer a suitor who stays." "I was not happy with your father's choice," Lady Elridge said in a conspiratorial tone, "and I am actually quite relieved the family saw the incompatibility." Mary nodded. "I did not like him either, and he did not like me." Lady Elridge laughed a little. "And I do not even know if I ought to be insulted or not. Did you see her clothes? Is she above us, below us? How can I decide what to think of her actions when I do not know where they come from?" "If she was rude, then you ought to be insulted, whoever she is," Mary replied. Lady Elridge shook her head. "That is just the thing, Mary. Rudeness depends wholly on the person." "It ought not to," Mary replied. "But it does." "Do you expect a small child to know to keep her skirts down?" Lady Elridge asked. Mary pondered it. "A very small child would probably need to be reminded several times," she concluded, "but an older child should know better." "And an adult woman?" Lady Elridge asked. "Unless she is mentally deficient, I would never expect an adult to need reminding of such a thing. And there we already have 3 standards for rudeness. The young child is not rude, and nor is the mentally deficient woman. Crude, perhaps, but they do not know better. Whereas the older child would be considered rude, and the adult woman unbelievably rude should they forget their modesty," Lady Elridge explained. "But Lady de Sevilla is an adult woman," Mary replied. "That was but an example, Mary. What I mean is that rudeness depends on what is expected of a person. If Lady de Sevilla were our equal, or our inferior, then nothing would justify her behaviour, as she should not have anything better to do. She ought to have made the time to visit us, and have no need to leave early. However, if she were our superior, then she probably has much better things to be doing," Lady Elridge concluded and glanced at Mary. "Do you understand?" Mary hesitated. Was Duke Haskett rude? Ordinarily, I would not presume to know whether or not a duke is being rude, but considering he deemed it fit to apologise, I suppose he must have been, Lady Elridge concluded. Mary could see in her mother's face that even talking about Duke Haskett caused her much pain. The man's words had caused her mother great distress and cut deeply into her pride. And yet, Mary forgave him. Mary knew her mother had been acting selfishly and thoughtlessly. She had not deserved to be spoken to the way he spoke to her, but he could not be entirely blamed for his speech either. A thought struck Mary. What if she had fallen in love with Duke Haskett? Truly in love, like a girl in one of Antoinette's favourite romance novels. Then what? What if Enrique de Sevilla had been a perfectly reasonable young man, and she was simply blinded by her passion for Duke Haskett? What if she could never love or respect another man again? A panic took over her heart, and drawing a deep breath, she stood up from her perch. "I believe I require some fresh air," she said to her mother. "I shall be in the garden." "Are you well, Mary?" her mother asked. Mary forced a slight smile. "I am simply in need of a little air, that is all." She knew her mother could tell something was amiss, but left the room before anything more could be said. Mary made her way swiftly downstairs, seizing her coat, gloves and bonnet on her way to the door. The de Sevillas had left, and her father was nowhere to be seen, probably in his office. Mary wandered towards the parlour, quickly spotting the door to the servants' quarters. She knocked. The door swung open a few seconds later to reveal the housekeeper. "Yes, miss," she said. "I must run an errand. Would you send the driver?" Mary asked, hoping to come across as authoritative. She did not. "Have you asked your parents for their permission?" the housekeeper asked, eyebrow raised. Mary nodded. "Of course I have." The housekeeper looked unconvinced, and for a moment Mary was afraid that the housekeeper would march upstairs and ask her mother directly. "Very well, I shall ask the driver to be with you immediately," she replied. Mary breathed a sigh of relief as the big door closed. Miss Ramsbottom may have been suspicious, but she was apparently not too suspicious. A few minutes later the door opened once again, and the driver, dressed and adjusting his gloves, nodded politely at her. "The coach will be at the front in a few minutes, miss." Mary smiled. "Thank you." Making their way to the front door, Mary felt a tightness in her chest that would not leave. What if her parents caught her before she left? Or what if they sent someone after her and stopped her? Or if they noticed her absence and she were punished? It was not too late to change her mind, go back indoors and pretend she had never intended to leave. But she had to. For her own good and her family's pride, she had to. After getting into the coach, she handed the driver an envelope before he could close the door. "Here, please." He glanced at the address, raised his brows in surprise, but said nothing as he shut the door and made his way to the front of the coach. Now it was most certainly too late to turn back. The one comfort she had was that this coach, this horse, and this driver were the best and fastest way into town. Even should her parents chase after her, not only would she have a head start, but they would have an inferior coach, an inferior horse, and a general servant driving. At least the winter cutbacks were proving of some use. The mansion was something even Mary had never seen before. It towered above her like a mountain, like something that simply could not be made by man. Usually she could tell from the outside of a building whether someone was home or not, but not this one. It felt like a castle. With slight trepidation she walked up the path towards the front door. Like on a church, there were 2 enormous 10-foot-tall wooden doors, with smaller human-sized doors set in them. When she was little, someone had told her that the small ones were for the humans, the big ones for angels. It put true fear into her for years, until she found out it was for processions and parades. But now she felt that same fear, the fear of standing before someone 1,000 times more powerful than yourself, the fear of being too small. She knocked on the door and waited. After a few minutes of standing, Heart in her throat, she knocked again. Nothing. No visible lights, no sounds within. The lawn had grown too high to walk on. The house had not been lived in or tended to for at least a week now. So if he was not here, and had probably not even stayed here when he last visited, where was he? Mary walked back down the path towards the coach, where she handed the driver a fistful of coins to buy his silence. "Please drive me to Antoinette's house now, and do not tell my parents I was here." The driver looked down at the coins. "No, miss, you went straight to see Miss Bird." "Thank you." Mary smiled as she climbed into the coach. "Mary!" Antoinette exclaimed as her cousin was escorted into the front room. "I didn't hear you were coming." "It was a spontaneous visit," Mary replied with a slight nervous giggle. "Do your parents know you are here?" Antoinette asked. "No," Mary said a little nervously. "I shall send a letter back with your driver. I am sure they are worried sick." Mary nodded. "Thank you." Once the letter was penned and on its way, Mary and Antoinette withdrew to the privacy of the lounge. "Well," Antoinette began, "now that we are alone, why did you not want your parents to know you were out?" Mary laughed a nervous laugh. "Well, originally I was not coming straight here." A mischievous glimmer shone in Antoinette's eye, as though thrilled she had finally persuaded her innocent little cousin to be a bit more daring. "Where were you going?" "To try and find Duke Haskett," Mary said, her face feeling warm like she had been standing in the sun. Antoinette let out a brief squeak of excitement. "What for? Did you see him?" Mary felt her blush growing hotter and hotter. I believe I am in love with him, and if the only way I can make my parents happy is by marrying, then I would like to try my best to marry a man I already love. Besides, my mother adores him." "What did he say?" "He must have thought you had gone stark, raving mad," Antoinette said in a tone of voice which suggested more rapture than concern. "That's the crux of it. He was not at his manor," Mary added with a sigh. "And it looks as though he has not been there for weeks. No servants, nothing. I have no idea where next to look for him." Antoinette was staring at her like she had grown a second head. "What is it? Is it my hair?" Mary asked, petting her tight bun. Antoinette shook her head. "You haven't heard, have you?" "Heard?" "About Duke Haskett and his estate and the settlement," Antoinette suggested. Mary shook her head. "I have not heard from him nor about him since the Isle of Wight." "You may wish to make sure you are firmly on your seat," Antoinette began, "because this might come as a shock, but rumour has it that Duke Haskett is in serious financial trouble. He had some legal action taken against him following his inheriting of the duchy, and there was a large settlement. Well, all these unattended manors around York are due to that. He had fired many servants to save money, and now he is having to sell manors and family belongings simply to avoid debt." Mary was staring, wide-eyed. "Heavens!" she finally managed to say with a gasp. "Will he be all right?" Antoinette nodded, then hesitated. "Well, I expect so. I only know the rumours. Perhaps it is not as bad as they say, or perhaps it is worse. Who can tell? Whatever the case, His Grace is not in as good a position as he seemed to be suggesting, and the parents of the various young women he was courting are less than happy, as I'm sure you can imagine." Mary nodded. "I can. I am sure my mother would be furious too if she had found out that a suitor had been lying about his wealth. But that confirms it for me." "Confirms what?" Antoinette asked. "That he cannot be a good match for me. He has lied to me twice already. How many more lies could I stand?" Mary sighed, anger building in her chest. "He may still have a great fortune, far greater than your family. And he is still a man of great status and connections," Antoinette said. "And now that no higher-class woman will have him, perhaps you stand a chance of becoming Duchess of York." Mary shook her head. "No, I cannot. How could I marry a man who lies to me continually? And who is a duke? And whom you love? Mary shook her head again. Love is a fool's word. I cannot trust my heart on matters such as these. My head is wise, and my head tells me that no good can come from a man who will not tell the truth. But you love him, Antoinette replied with a slightly mournful tone. I do. Or at least I think I do, she paused. Thought I did. But unless he can swear to forever be honest, how could I marry him? Mary felt her heart ache as she continued to insist against him. She desired him so much, but she knew that it was not to be. Now, let us talk of something more jolly before my parents come to find me. As expected, Mary's parents were not happy with what she had done. She saw it in their eyes. It appeared that they were relieved that she had gone to see Antoinette and no one else, but they were confused and frustrated by her sudden defiance. Mary had attempted to pretend she had simply forgotten, but the housekeeper had informed them of her lie already. Thankfully, the driver was sticking to her story, apparently the only person around her household who had her best interest at heart. But now they sat at the dinner table with an awkward silence hanging over them as Mary wondered what to do next. She was thankful in a way that he had not been home. Now she knew she had been lied to a second time. But despite everything, her situation had not changed from that morning, and a creeping fear was suggesting that she was not as marriage-worthy as she had thought. Interrupting her train of thought, there was a loud knock at the door. It echoed through the silence. Sir Elridge furrowed his brow and put his cutlery down. I wonder who it could be at this time of night. It's been such an eventful day already, lamented Lady Elridge. Mary, too, was feeling very tired and not prepared to greet guests, but apparently there was no avoiding it. The knocks came louder and stronger, and then stopped. After a moment's silence, the housekeeper's footsteps approached the door. She peered in. Sorry to disturb you, but we have company. Can they not wait? Sir Elridge replied. It is Duke Haskett, sir. Chapter 11. Duke Haskett. After everything she knew, she still felt her heart leap a little. She took a deep breath and had another sip of wine to steady her nerves. No, he was not an appropriate man. He may be of great status, and therefore worth entertaining a night, but she ought not to think of him as a suitor any longer. Please invite him in, Sir Elridge said, and set him a place at the table. The housekeeper nodded and the door slowly closed behind her. As the servants laid a new place at the table, the door opened again, but what emerged from behind it came as a shock to everyone. It was Duke Haskett, and he did not look well. His clothes were not pressed and were soiled, as though he had worn the same ones for days. His hair was tousled and his beard had overgrown. Beneath his eyes were two deep purple marks, as though he had not slept for days. There was a clatter as Sir Elridge dropped his fork into his plate. "Duke Haskett!" exclaimed Lady Elridge. "Whatever has happened to you?" He shook his head and sighed. I have encountered some misfortunes," he said, seating himself at the place which had been set for him. "I endeavoured to protect myself against them, but to no avail. My wealth is fast dwindling, and my fair-weather friends have left me. All I ask is a little sympathy in my time of need." Mary could see the conflict on her mother's face, but eventually she smiled softly. "We shall provide you with food and board until further notice. Our wealth may not be as great as you are familiar with, but we could easily support one more until you are back on your feet. Is that not right, James?" Sir Elridge nodded. "Anything for our Duke." "Should I even remain your Duke much longer?" Duke Haskett said with a sigh. "My brother is claiming his right to the duchy, and perhaps he shall win that claim." "I did not know you had a brother," replied Lady Elridge. Duke Haskett nodded. "Indeed I do. He is younger, and so has no traditional right to the position. But several debts have been called against my name, and my brother is writing to the Crown, announcing my inability to properly maintain the duchy and requesting that he take over from me. And then, I do not know what shall become of me." "I am sure your brother has a plan for you," Mary said reassuringly. "Oh, I know for a fact that he does," replied Duke Haskett with an expression of pain and despair, "and that plan does not bear thinking about." A great silence fell over the table. "We shall keep you for as long as it takes," said Sir Elridge, "just as my wife promised." Duke Haskett smiled meekly. "You are too kind, too kind. I am forever in your favour." He looked down at his place as a plate of food was set between his cutlery. "If you forgive me, I shall now have my dinner." Sir Elridge smiled and nodded. "Indeed, we all require some nourishment tonight. Eat and drink, then our servants shall prepare you fresh clothes and a bed. Tomorrow we can discuss the situation in more detail." Duke Haskett ate with the usual care of a noble, and yet with a speed and relish which suggested he had not had a proper meal in some time. Watching him, Mary felt her heart stir once again. She looked down at her plate during the meal and avoided eye contact with him the remainder of the night. The next morning Mary awoke early and, finding it impossible to fall back asleep, made her way quietly downstairs to practice her pianoforte. The servants were, as usual, already up and busying themselves getting the house ready for the Elridges and their guest. Mary briefly wondered whether the instrument could be heard from the guest room. She knew her parents would not be able to hear it, but she had never had to consider whether playing the pianoforte at 7 in the morning might awaken a guest. She leafed through the music books, looking for the right one for the morning. "I see you are already up," Duke Haskett said. Mary spun around on her heels, shocked by how quietly he had crept up on her. He looked a completely different man. He had washed, shaved, and was dressed in clean, pressed clothes. His face looked fuller and less worn after a good night's sleep, and he was smiling lightly. "Please forgive me," he added. "I was simply being quiet as I believed nobody else was awake." Mary shook her head. "It was nothing, just a little surprise," she said. Normally she would say something to remind him that they were there alone. But now, after everything, she did not feel that worry. The door was open and servants were about. It was not as though anything inappropriate could happen, or anyone could or would want to start a rumour. "I suppose you think me an embarrassment," he said quietly. Mary shook her head. "Why would I ever think such a thing?" "Because the wealthy, powerful man you had admired, who scorned you, is now crawling back and begging favours from you," he replied. "You may have been wealthy, but we ought to share what we have. You may have been powerful, but we ought to help those who need us, not just whom we need. And you may have scorned me, but you are still created in God's image and you still deserve to be treated with dignity," Mary replied. His eyes shone. "Is that so? You are much kinder than the others were," he replied. "The others?" Mary asked. "I was stranded away from any manor I have that is still tended to," he replied, "and so I asked my previous hosts whether they could keep me for another few weeks, just until I had news from my brother or my estate. And yet, knowing that I had barely any money, they would not let me back in." He chuckled. "Then I went to another friend, who also closed his door on me. Women who once wished to wed me would not look at me, and men whom I considered friends turned me away at their gate." "Well, some turned away our Holy Mother," Mary replied. "It did not make the decision right. What if I am never able to regain my wealth or my status?" Duke Haskett sighed. "I would be a terrible burden to you." Those words struck Mary to her heart. At least she knew exactly how that felt. And although she had not been able to find an answer for herself, now that someone else came to her with the same problem, the answer came to her also. "But you would not be a burden. It is a great joy to bring help to those who need us, and to know that those who matter to us are safe and well. It would cause so much pain to us, as human beings, if we had to live every day knowing we had let down those who needed us, and God is sure to punish those who treat others as mere conveniences." She paused briefly. "Though he is sure to punish liars too." Duke Haskett sighed. "I know. I should have told you the truth, the whole truth from the start. But you must understand me. or at least attempt to. I am, or was, in a dangerous position, and I could not allow for a woman who did not love me for who I am to marry me. A woman who would marry me for my wealth or my status would surely make my life miserable, as my mother did to my father. "The same mother who taught you to play pianoforte?" Mary replied. "Or was that also a lie?" "No, that was true. Everything other than the circumstances concerning my wealth and title was the truth. And she was a wonderful mother, but a terrible wife." He shook his head. "I will not allow myself to marry someone who would wed me to use me." Mary nodded. "I understand. And I suppose I made the right decision too. After all, would you have me now as I am? As I could be soon," he said mournfully. "I did. I did believe I could love you, Mary, until you discovered who I was and became so interested. It hurt me to see you change for something like that. Could you have loved and married Mr. Haskett, as you intended to love and marry Duke Haskett?" Mary felt her heart leap again. She looked to him. That handsome face, those intelligent eyes, the slight despair worn into his features. She still loved him. Even like this. She would always love him. She sat down beside him on the chaise longue. "I could," she whispered. "I could love you, whoever you are." Duke Haskett looked up and his eyes met hers again. Mary felt herself blushing but did not look away. She smiled. He smiled back and rested his hand on hers softly. "You really could, after this?" Mary nodded. "You would have to persuade my parents, but I have a feeling they may still be open to the idea." "Which idea would that be?" Sir Elridge's voice said. Mary startled slightly, but was relieved that her father had not yet reached the doorway when he began speaking, and had not seen them sitting together like that. In a split second, Duke Haskett was standing, and Mary, wondering whether there was a way to stop a blush, had shifted down the chaise longue to ensure there was enough space between them so as to avoid suspicion. Her father and mother walked through the doorway. "Awake already?" asked Sir Elridge with a smile. Now, I know you two are friends, but I must insist that you keep an escort of some description." Mary nodded sternly. "I am sorry, Father. Duke Haskett had an important question, and I forgot myself." Sir Elridge shook his head slowly but seemed unperturbed. No harm had been done. "Now, what question might that be?" he asked Duke Haskett. Duke Haskett nodded in acknowledgement. "Actually, it pertains to that friendship which you just mentioned. I was asking Marianne if she would still be willing to consider me as a suitor, despite the disarray of my personal life at present." "And what was her answer?" asked Lady Elridge. Mary avoided her mother's gaze. "Provided you were to agree," she said, "I would not be unhappy to wed Duke Haskett, whatever the circumstances." She glanced up at her parents out of the corner of her eye. Her father looked to her mother. They seemed internally conflicted, and yet looking into each other's eyes, a certain peace overcame their troubled expressions. "I suppose," began Sir Elridge, "that we might consider such a marriage." "But I could lose my title, my wealth, everything," Duke Haskett countered. Sir Elridge shook his head again. "I am aware of that. But Lady Elridge and I have had a few exchanges over the past few days, and we have reached an agreement. Our own marriage may not have furthered either of us socially, but it gave us something strong to rely upon during our times of need and hardship. And having you come to us last night, it made us see that it is this support which makes a marriage great. A noble could always lose his title. You could have wed Marianne and lost your position after. And yet, with the right support, we have no doubt you will be back on your feet. It is not a bad thing for her to marry someone she believes she can support and care for, someone who can do the same for her." Duke Haskett smiled and nodded. "In that case, I have another announcement. Marianne, I am sure you recall what I told you just now, that I had only lied about my circumstances." Mary nodded, slightly baffled by the change in conversation. "When we were in the garden, what did I tell you of my family?" he asked. That you have—" Mary gasped. "No living family." "That was the truth," he said. "I am sorry to confess to you that I have still been lying about my circumstances. I have no brother, and my status is not at risk. I needed to know for sure whether my prospective brides were invested in me as a man or just interested in a title." Mary realized her mouth was open in shock and quickly closed it. "But She shook her head. "Duke Haskett." "I am so terribly sorry, Mary," he said, dropping to one knee. "But as I have been saying, there are many women who would choose me for my title and my wealth alone. And I truly wish to marry you, but I needed to know that you would want to marry me for myself." Mary shook her head slowly again. "I cannot believe you treated us in such a manner a second time." "But it was the last time," Duke Haskett replied, "because now I know that you are the right woman for me, the woman I shall make my wife." "No," Mary found her mouth forming the words before she could even think. "No, Duke Haskett, you shall not." His eyes widened, and this time it was his turn to stare, open-mouthed in sheer confused shock, as the words sunk in. Mary glanced at her parents, who were suddenly looking tense and bewildered, eyes darting from her to Duke Haskett. Lady Elridge started to collapse a little, and Sir Elridge helped her into a chair and offered her the phial of smelling salts. When Mary's eyes returned to Duke Haskett's face, he had not moved a muscle. He was still as a statue, and she could not blame them for being surprised. After all, she could scarcely believe her own lips, even as they formed the words once more. "No, you shall not make me your wife." Chapter 12. Duke Haskett laughed slightly nervously. "Ah, this is a joke, is it not? A little revenge. I must admit you tricked me but for a moment there. But that was very cruel. Look at your poor mother." His eyes met hers, and he instantly stopped. There were a few seconds' silence between them. Slowly he stood up. "You are not joking," he stated. Mary shook her head. "No, I am not." "But why would you say such things?" Duke Haskett replied. Mary was asking herself the same question. Was this not what she had always wanted? To marry her perfect man, to climb the ranks, and to become her own independent self. And here she was turning it away. She turned her back on him and went over to where her father was helping her mother awaken, and held Lady Elridge's hand tenderly. "I am sorry, Mother," she said softly. "I did not mean to alarm you." She could not look at Duke Haskett. She could not find the right words with which to address him. She could not reconcile the emotions she was feeling: love, pain, fear, stress, confusion. All she knew was that one emotion had taken over all the rest: anger. Yes, she was angry at Duke Haskett, and unlike the rest of her emotional cocktail, she knew exactly where her anger had come from. "Duke Haskett, you said that when your true identity was revealed to me at first, my attitude towards you changed," she began, turning to face him. "And you are right, it did. But not because I was so hungry for status and wealth that I wished to impress a duke. My attitude towards you changed because my feelings towards you changed. You had gone from a secretive stranger and a liar to being a transparent man whom I could put some trust in. And that man, that Christopher Haskett, I would marry no matter who he was. But you, I do not know who you are, and I cannot agree to marry you." Mary could feel all her anger, all her confusion, all her stress coming to a head. It felt good to tell him. But then again, it suddenly didn't. He wore an expression like a hurt puppy, and suddenly his head hung, his eyes fixed on the floor. He sighed heavily. "I am a complete and utter fool," he said. "You are," Mary said before she could help herself. "I am sorry, Duke Haskett laughed softly and shook his head. "No, I am. I had been so focused on my own interests and my own fears that I treated you, all of you, like you were nothing, like your hearts did not matter to me. And in doing so I have destroyed something so precious. I will not request another opportunity to prove myself. I do not deserve it." Lady Elridge sat up as straight as she could. "Duke Haskett, you do not need to apologize. A man of your status in your position, sometimes one needs to do such things so as to determine who one's true friends are." She smiled meekly. Duke Haskett smiled back at her. "That is true, Lady Elridge. And looking back upon the time I have known your family, it is clear to me that I am no friend to any of you." He began walking towards the doorway. Mary's heart ached and she scolded it wordlessly for its disobedience. It begged her to reach out to him, to grab him and bring him back. She tried to stop watching him leave, but could not tear her eyes from the man. When he stopped and turned around, Mary felt as though she could faint. But all he said was, "I shall send someone to return the clothes you kindly loaned me." And then he was gone. "I cannot believe what my eyes have seen, what my ears just heard," Lady Elridge sighed. "Mary," she shook her head. "I only had the courage to do so because you were right, and Father was right, everyone was right," Mary said. "Marrying a duke does not mean I would be a duchess forever. Marrying a rude man and a leer is not grounds for a happy marriage, and I cannot love someone I do not know." Lady Elridge was still shaking her head. "When did you become so defiant?" Mary paused. "I did not mean to be defiant, Mother, or to hurt you, or Father, or Duke Haskett." "When did you become so foolish?" Sir Elridge countered. Mary shook her head. "Whatever do you mean?" "You do love Duke Haskett, do you not?" he asked her. Mary nodded. "Well, I believe I do. But how can I know for sure? He has lied so much to us all." Sir Elridge shook his head. "He has lied about one thing only, his title. All else he has told us has either been true or part of the lie surrounding his title. Did you love him for the title?" Mary shook her head. "I loved him for his gentleness, and his wit, and his skills playing pianoforte." She paused. "And none of those were lies, as far as we know." Sir Elridge nodded. "He may have lied to you, to all of us, and you are wise in not wishing to marry him immediately. It will take some time to rebuild the trust he has lost. But the things you love him for are hard to falsify. And he is still an excellent choice socially and financially. Were we able to, your mother and I would overrule your wish to avoid him. However, the damage which you have dealt may only be corrected by you. He will not take you back unless he trusts you will love him. If you still love him, perhaps you ought to speak to him once more." Mary glanced out the window and mulled over what her father had said. Once again, they were right. Once again, she had been thoughtless. Even now her heart ached to think of the pain she had caused Duke Haskett, that handsome, charming, witty gentleman. And he would be handsome, charming and witty, no matter what lies he told about his status. "I will apologize to him, and, if he is still interested, I would like him to court me once more," Mary finally said. Her parents breathed a sigh of relief. "However," Mary continued, "we must have complete openness. We cannot invite him into our lives if he will lie to us. He has disappointed us twice, which is already 2 times too many. I will not allow him to hurt us again should he disappoint us a 3rd time." Lady Elridge nodded and smiled. "You are wise beyond your years, Mary. That is a very smart agreement." After sending a servant to catch up with Duke Haskett, all they could do was wait. Mary sat at her pianoforte and played. 3 days had passed since the servant returned. Duke Haskett's reply was that he would consider the situation and they would know in due time what he intended to do. And after 3 whole days, Mary had a feeling that she had done too much damage. Playing some lully, she wondered what she would do now. She was sure that her parents would find her another suitor, as many as it took. But after Duke Haskett, she felt certain that nobody else would inspire the same affection she had felt for him. Whoever her parents chose, she would respect, obey, and care for them as a good wife should. and in turn her parents had agreed to make absolutely certain that whichever man they found would align with her values. But her heart would always belong to Duke Haskett. Miss Ramsbottom rested a hand on Mary's shoulder, causing her to jump briefly. "Sorry to startle you, miss, but you have a guest." Mary nodded. "Please, invite her in," she said. "Him," Miss Ramsbottom corrected. Mary felt her heart twitch and flutter. And yet, no, it was probably one of her cousins. She drew a deep breath. She dared not hope. Turning around on her stool, she watched the doorway as Miss Ramsbottom escorted Duke Haskett in. He smiled, his expression still bold and roguish, but with a slight softness behind it, a new air of humility that even he could not hide. "I believe you wish to see me," he said as Miss Ramsbottom exited the room, leaving the door open. "3 days ago," Mary replied. "Oh, I suppose I have missed my chance," he said, his smile shrinking a bit. "You have a new suitor?" Mary smiled and shook her head. "No, no new suitor." "Would you still see me today, then?" he asked. Mary nodded. "Please continue playing," he said as he walked over to her. "I take it you still enjoy Lully?" Mary nodded again as she turned her stool around. "His music reminds me of you," she said. "Is that so? Even after all that has happened, you still wish to be reminded of me?" he asked. "Every day, for as long as I shall live," she replied. "Even if I were not to marry you?" Duke Haskett asked in a low tone. Mary paused briefly, then resumed playing. "Even so, I shall never wish to forget you." "Then I suppose," Duke Haskett released an overly affected sigh, "it is my duty to at least court you some more. We cannot have you marrying some poor fellow and dreaming of me every night now, can we?" Mary laughed a little. "No, we cannot." It took some time to rebuild the trust which had fallen apart, but now, as the leaves were turning, Mary knew that she had made the right decision to give him a second chance. While walking through the park, her parents and a couple of servants a few yards behind them, Mary laid her hand on Duke Haskett's arm. She felt at ease. Nothing untoward had occurred in those few months. He had remained a gentleman, remained witty, remained intelligent, and most importantly, remained honest. Looking up into his eyes, she felt herself melting, longing for his touch. She had progressed beyond interest, doubt, and affection, into something which blossomed more and more each day. That yearning which had awoken in her the first time her suitor had been announced was now a burning fire. And in his eyes she could see the flame was also burning. It was time. Stopping by the gate at the end of the park, they waited for her parents to catch up with them. Mary felt her heart thumping in her chest like it was trying to burst out. They had spoken of proposals recently, and seeing that glimmer in Duke Haskett's eye let her know that he would seize the moment. They all stopped by the gate, where a servant produced a few bottles of cordial, glasses and wrapped sandwiches as refreshments before the walk back home. Mary had no appetite for hers. She simply glanced up expectantly at Duke Haskett. "Sir Elridge," Duke Haskett began, "I have known and courted your daughter now for quite some time, and I have been thinking it would be a dreadful shame to have a wedding in midwinter." Sir Elridge started slightly, looked at the young couple, then smiled knowingly. "That it would. I was thinking perhaps a fall wedding would be quite lovely. The red leaves thick in the trees would make it a day to remember," he continued. Sir Elridge nodded. "Sir Elridge, would you be so kind as to grant me your daughter's hand in marriage?" "Of course," Sir Elridge replied. There was a slight popping sound as, leaning against the gate for support, Lady Elridge opened her phial of smelling salts and inhaled deeply. She looked dizzy, but was smiling. "Congratulations, my sweet," she finally said, wrapping her arms around Mary and hugging her closely. "Congratulations to both of you from the bottom of my heart." The bells rang over the hills and the crowd murmured gently as Sir Elridge took Mary's hand at the bottom of the aisle. She was a vision in white, with layers of pure white lace around the skirts of her dress, pure white flowers in her veil, a string of pearls around her neck, and a bouquet of white roses clasped between her hands. Her face was carefully painted. The pews were packed, with a few people she knew, but largely people she did not, on both sides. She assumed that many of her mother's friends and relations from back when she lived with the Baron were in attendance, and she spied many high-ranking nobles on Duke Haskett's side of the room. At the top of the aisle, in the last row of pews, she saw her mother and Antoinette peering out at her. Lady Elridge was weeping heartily. Antoinette was grinning, brimming with excitement. Walking up the aisle, she laid eyes upon her groom for the first time that day. Duke Haskett stood proud in a blue suit and black overcoat, sporting a bold blue, white and green cravat honouring York's flag. His shoes and hair shone under the bright light of the autumn sun, tinted by the stained glass windows of the church. The ceremony went by as a blur. Mary held her father's arm as the vicar spoke. But she did not see her father or the vicar. Her eyes could not be drawn from her groom. All she could do was gaze upon him and admire him. He looked down into her eyes, and she could tell that he was just as enraptured. "Wilt thou," began the vicar, "have this woman to thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honour, and keep her in sickness and in health, and forsaking all other, keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live?" "I will," replied Duke Haskett, his face reddening. "And will thou have this man to thy wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou obey him, and serve him, love, honour, and keep him in sickness and in health, and forsaking all other, keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live?" "I will," said Mary with a light sigh. The vicar took the ring from the pillow and passed it to Duke Haskett, who took it in one hand, her small fingers in his other. "With this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen." Duke Haskett's words sent shivers down Mary's spine. As Duke Haskett finished slipping the ring onto her finger, she gently clasped his hand. His fingers entwined with hers, and he leaned in for the kiss. Mary had been waiting for this day for so long, she felt as though her heart could burst. His soft lips on hers felt hot as coals, and she wondered whether this was why some brides fainted at their wedding. She could faintly perceive the applause in the pews, but it was as though through a wall, a world apart from them. All she cared for was Duke Haskett, as he broke the kiss and, taking her hand, began walking her back down the aisle. Her eyes were fixed on him, as they were showered with rose petals. Exiting the church, they walked out into streaming bright sunlight, with a faint breeze bringing down fiery red and orange leaves across the church gardens. Their coach waited at the bottom of the steps to take them to Duke Haskett's mansion for signing the registry and having their wedding breakfast. He lifted her up into the coach, to some applause from the younger men in attendance, before climbing in after her. For the first time, they sat snugly side by side, in complete privacy. Besides the driver, Mary felt at peace with the world. She leaned against his shoulder, already exhausted. He ran his fingertips gently over her hair. She lifted her head and locked eyes with him. Briefly, she wondered whether she ought to say something. What was there to say that they didn't know already? Their lips met once more as the coach raced down the lane, towards their future as one. Read the next book in the series now.
Click on the link in the description to read the next book in the series. Share this video with your friend or watch on of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.